Big agriculture spent millions lobbying to make these 15 vegetables illegal. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're too powerful. These medieval crops contain compounds so potent they make modern GMOs look like candy. But here's what they don't want you discovering about why they're still banned today. Ever wonder why your grandmother's salad had more kick than anything you can buy today? Well, let me tell you about purslane. The little green troublemaker that big agriculture wants you to forget exists. This crunchy, slightly salty plant was once the darling of medieval dinner tables. Farmers couldn't get enough of it. But here's the kicker. Today, most people spray it with herbicide and call it a weed. Talk about a fall from grace that would make a soap opera jealous. The numbers will blow your mind. Purslane packs more omega-3 fatty acids than most fish. Yeah, you heard that right. While everyone's popping expensive supplements, this weed is sitting in their backyard laughing at them. Then there's the vitamin E content. Spinach thinks it's tough? Purslane has more vitamin E than Popeye's favorite green. And beta-carotene? It makes carrots look like amateurs at their own game. Ancient Romans treated this plant like liquid gold. The Chinese have been using it for thousands of years as medicine. These weren't dumb people. They knew something we've conveniently forgotten. But here's what really gets me fired up. The antioxidant levels in purslane make most genetically modified vegetables look like they're not even trying. We're talking 10 times stronger in some cases. 10 times. The taste alone should have kept it popular. It's like nature decided to create the perfect salad addition. Crunchy, flavorful, and packed with nutrients that would make a multivitamin jealous. Speaking of forgotten treasures, wait until you hear about salsify, the mysterious root that tastes exactly like something from the ocean. Ever heard of a vegetable that tastes like seafood but grows in dirt? Well, your great-great-grandmother probably knew all about salsify. This peculiar root vegetable was once as common on dinner tables as potatoes are today. But here's the kicker. Big agriculture wanted nothing to do with it. Why? Because salsify takes its sweet time growing. We're talking 8 to 9 months from seed to harvest. Compare that to the quick turnaround crops that fill supermarket shelves, and you can see why corporate farms gave it the boot. They needed vegetables that grew fast and shipped faster. What they threw away was nutritional gold. Salsify packs more fiber than most vegetables you'll find today. It's loaded with prebiotics that feed the good bacteria in your gut, something our ancestors got naturally, but we now buy in expensive supplements. The taste? Imagine if an oyster and a parsnip had a baby. Sounds weird, but it's absolutely delicious. Medieval cooks knew this secret. They'd roast it, fry it, or toss it into stews. The flavor was so unique that wealthy families considered it a delicacy. Then there's the potassium content. This humble root delivers heart-healthy benefits that put many modern vegetables to shame. Your blood pressure would thank you, but good luck finding salsify at your local grocery store. The real irony? While we're engineering tomatoes to last weeks on shelves, we abandoned a vegetable that naturally supported digestive health for centuries. Makes you wonder what other treasures got buried in agriculture's rush for efficiency. But salsify isn't the only casualty of this vegetable revolution. Medieval cooks knew something we've completely forgotten about lovage. This towering herb didn't just season their stews, it practically ran their entire medicine cabinet. Picture celery's overachieving cousin who went to medical school. That's lovage for you. While modern celery tastes like crunchy water with commitment issues, lovage packs a flavor punch that could wake up a hibernating bear. One leaf does the work of 10 celery stalks. But here's where things get interesting. Big agriculture didn't just ignore lovage, they actively discouraged it. Why? Well, when you can grow something that replaces multiple seasonings and medicines, suddenly you don't need their expensive seed packets and chemical fertilizers. The anti-inflammatory compounds in lovage make ibuprofen look like a participation trophy. Medieval healers used it for everything from kidney stones to joint pain. Modern studies confirm what those old-timers knew. Lovage contains quercetin and other compounds that actually reduce inflammation at the cellular level. Then there's the practical magic. Every single part of this plant works over time. Leaves for seasoning, stems for cooking, roots for medicine, and seeds for digestive tea. It's like getting a Swiss Army knife when everyone else sells you single-blade razors. Your grandmother probably grew this without even knowing its proper name. She'd call it that big herb that makes everything taste better. Smart woman. The real kicker? Lovage grows like it's trying to prove something. Plant it once, and it'll feed your family for decades. No wonder the seed companies aren't thrilled about promoting it. But wait until you hear about our next banned vegetable. It's so naturally sweet that royalty hoarded it like gold. Medieval royalty knew what they were doing when they made skirret their go-to dessert. This sweet root vegetable was basically nature's candy bar, except it actually made you healthier instead of sending you to the dentist. But here's where things get interesting. While kings were munching on skirret at fancy banquets, modern agriculture decided this royal treat wasn't worth their time. Why? Because sugar beets and cane could be mass-produced faster than you could say profit margin. Well, joke's on them. Skirret packs more inulin than a health food store supplement. Aisle. This stuff is pure gold for your digestive system. Makes sense, right? Your gut bacteria throw a party every time inulin shows up. And for folks dealing with diabetes, skirret's natural sweetness doesn't spike blood sugar like those processed alternatives that replaced it. Then there's the texture game. Ever tried adding something crunchy to your soup that actually belongs there? Skirret delivers that perfect bite. Not mushy like overcooked carrots, not tough like undercooked potatoes. It's the Goldilocks of root vegetables. And the weird part is, while GMO crops struggle in changing weather patterns, skirret thrives in cooler climates. This thing laughs at frost like a Canadian in shorts during winter. The real kicker? Most people have never even heard of it. Walk into any grocery store and ask for skirret, you'll get the same blank stare you'd get asking for a unicorn. But adventurous cooks who discover this forgotten gem quickly realize they've stumbled onto something special. Speaking of forgotten treasures that pack a nutritional punch, good King Henry sounds like royalty, but this poor man's asparagus was actually the working-class hero of medieval gardens. And boy, did big agriculture want this one gone fast. Here's the thing about good King Henry. It made modern crops look like nutritional weaklings. We're talking about a plant loaded with iron, vitamin C, and more nutrients than your typical supermarket spinach could dream of. But that wasn't the problem for industrial farming. The real issue? This green giant was slower than your uncle trying to figure out his smartphone. While GMO crops could be rushed to market, good King Henry took its sweet time developing those nutrient-dense leaves. Patience and profit margins don't exactly shake hands, if you know what I mean. Then there's the versatility factor that really spooked the agriculture industry. You could toss these leaves raw into salads or cook them like spinach. The young shoots? They taste remarkably similar to asparagus. One plant, multiple uses. Sounds great for families, terrible for companies selling specialized vegetables. But here's where it gets interesting. Good King Henry is a perennial, meaning it comes back year after year without replanting. No seeds to buy annually, no dependency on agricultural suppliers. That's like having a vegetable garden that runs on autopilot. Medieval folks also used it medicinally for treating wounds, thanks to its anti-inflammatory compounds. Modern research is finally catching up to what they knew centuries ago. Speaking of plants that made agriculture executives nervous, wait until you hear about the groundnut, a protein powerhouse that could have changed everything. Here's something that'll make your grandmother roll her eyes. We've been ignoring one of nature's most complete foods while obsessing over fancy supplements. Groundnut used to be the MVP of Native American agriculture. And honestly, it makes our modern potatoes look like nutritional lightweights. This climbing vine produced tubers that were basically nature's multivitamin. We're talking about 3 times more protein than potatoes and enough iron to make Popeye jealous. But here's where it gets interesting. Groundnut wasn't just nutritious, it was practically indestructible. While modern crops throw tantrums over soil conditions, groundnut thrived in places where other plants would wave the white flag. Poor soil? No problem. Drought conditions? Bring it on. This plant was like that tough neighbor who never complains about anything. Then, industrial farming showed up with its bigger is better mentality. Groundnut's crime? It took patience. You couldn't just plant endless rows and harvest with massive machines. It required actual knowledge. Something that didn't fit the factory farming playbook. Makes sense, right? Why bother with a nutrient-dense, sustainable crop when you can grow uniform potatoes that ship well and last forever in storage? The climbing habit that made groundnut so resilient became its downfall. Monoculture operations wanted crops that stayed put, not ones that reached for the sky and actually improved soil health while growing. But here's what really gets me fired up. We ditched this powerhouse for convenience while our ancestors knew exactly what they were doing. Speaking of plants our ancestors got right, wait until you hear about the medieval leaf that made winter meals sing. Your grandmother probably threw this weed into her salads without thinking twice about it. Sorrel was everywhere in medieval gardens, and for good reason too. This tangy little green packs more vitamin A than most vegetables sitting in your grocery cart right now. We're talking about levels that make spinach look like it's slacking off. But here's where it gets interesting. Sorrel tastes like someone crossed lettuce with a lemon wedge. Medieval cooks weren't just tossing it around for kicks. They knew something we've forgotten. This stuff could survive winters that would make a polar bear shiver. While other vegetables gave up and died, sorrel kept growing like that one neighbor who insists on mowing his lawn in December. Then there's the preservation angle that'll blow your mind. The natural oxalates in sorrel work like tiny food guardians, keeping things fresh longer than your average green. Think of it as nature's refrigerator before refrigerators existed. But why did we ditch this powerhouse? Simple. Big agriculture wanted vegetables that could sit in trucks for weeks without wilting. Sorrel's crime? It was too fresh, too flavorful, and too good at what it did naturally. The weird part is how we replaced something this nutritious with bland, storage-friendly alternatives that need chemical cocktails just to grow properly. Meanwhile, sorrel laughs at pesticides because it's naturally tough. Well, there's another medieval vegetable that makes sorrel look tame by comparison. This next one was so prized that ancient Romans built their entire cardiovascular health around it. Meet cardoon, the artichoke's forgotten big brother that medieval folks couldn't get enough of. While artichokes get all the spotlight at fancy restaurants, cardoon was doing the heavy lifting in European gardens centuries before GMOs were even a twinkle in a scientist's eye. This towering plant looks like artichoke on steroids. We're talking stalks that can reach 6 feet tall, taller than your average teenager and probably more useful too. But here's where it gets interesting. Cardoon doesn't mess around when it comes to your heart health. Studies show cardoon extract can slash bad cholesterol levels by up to 30%. That's better than most prescription drugs, and it won't cost you your firstborn child in pharmacy bills. The active compounds in cardoon work like tiny janitors, scrubbing your arteries clean while you sleep. Then there's the fiber content. 1 cup delivers nearly half your daily fiber needs, which means your digestive system runs smoother than a well-oiled lawnmower. Your blood sugar stays steady too, unlike the roller coaster ride you get from processed foods. But why did big agriculture give cardoon the boot? Simple economics, my friend. This plant takes patience. Something modern farming hates more than a vegetarian at a barbecue convention. Cardoon needs careful blanching, specific growing conditions, and skilled harvesting. Mass production prefers vegetables that grow fast, ship easy, and look identical. The Mediterranean diet crowd still swears by cardoon for good reason. While we're stuck with bland, nutrient-stripped vegetables designed for shelf life, cardoon delivers real nutrition that actually does something. Speaking of forgotten nutritional powerhouses, wait until you hear about rampion. Ever heard of a vegetable so charming it landed in fairy tales? Well, meet rampion, the delicate green that once ruled medieval salad bowls before big agriculture decided we didn't need it anymore. Back in the day, people went absolutely crazy for rampion's slightly sweet leaves. Think of the mildest radish you've ever tasted, then make it even gentler. That's rampion for you. Medieval folks couldn't get enough of this stuff, and honestly, who could blame them? But here's where things get interesting. While we're all munching on bland, watery lettuce that tastes like disappointment, rampion was packing some serious nutritional punch. This little green powerhouse contains more magnesium than most vegetables you'll find in today's supermarket. And magnesium? That's your bone's best friend. Now, why did this superstar disappear? Simple economics, my friend. Lettuce grows fast, ships well, and looks uniform on store shelves. Rampion takes its sweet time and doesn't photograph as nicely for Instagram. So guess which one won the popularity contest? The funny thing is, rampion practically grows itself. It's tougher than a $2 steak when it comes to pests and diseases. While modern crops need constant babying and chemical treatments, rampion just shrugs off problems like they're nothing. You might recognize this plant from Rapunzel. Yes, that fairy tale. The whole story starts because someone desperately wanted rampion from a witch's garden. Makes sense, right? But here's what really gets me fired up about the next vegetable on our list. The Romans didn't mess around when it came to food. While they were busy conquering the world, they also conquered dinner plates with something called Alexanders. Think of it as celery's overachieving older brother who went to medical school. This remarkable plant could feed you from top to bottom, literally. Roots, stems, leaves, even the seeds were edible. Makes sense, right? Why waste any part when you're building an empire and need every nutritional advantage you can get? But here's where it gets interesting. Alexanders packed a secret weapon called astragalline. Medieval folks didn't know the fancy name, but they knew this stuff worked magic on their medicine shelves. Stomach troubles, Alexanders. Joint pain, more Alexanders. It was like having a pharmacy growing in your backyard. The taste? Imagine celery decided to get spicy and develop some personality. That peppery kick made Roman soldiers feel invincible. Or maybe that was just the conquest talking. Then modern agriculture showed up like that friend who ruins every good party. Why grow something complex and flavorful when you can mass-produce bland, predictable crops? Alexanders required actual knowledge to harvest properly. Each part needed different timing, different techniques. Well, that was too much work for industrial farming. They wanted vegetables that behaved like factory workers, uniform, predictable, and easy to manage. Alexanders was more like an artist, temperamental but brilliant. Ancient murals still show extensive cultivation of this powerhouse plant. Those civilizations understood something we've forgotten about: real nutrition versus artificial enhancement. But speaking of plants that literally lift your spirits, there's one medieval favorite that was celebrated for inducing actual euphoria. Here's your grandmother's secret weapon against stress, and big agriculture pretends it doesn't exist. Borage was once called the herb of gladness because medieval folks swore it could lift anyone's spirits faster than a surprise inheritance check. But here's where it gets interesting. This blue-flowered beauty contains more gamma-linolenic acid than those fancy engineered crops could ever dream of producing. We're talking about the same stuff they put in expensive supplements, except borage delivers it naturally. Your wallet stays happy too. The flowers? Completely edible. Toss them on salads and watch dinner guests wonder if you've hired a 5-star chef. They taste like cucumber with a hint of honey, and they're shaped like perfect little stars. Makes you wonder why we settled for boring lettuce when our ancestors had this colorful masterpiece. Then there's the controversy. Some places restrict borage because of its alkaloids. Sounds scary, right? Well, coffee has alkaloids too, and nobody's banning your morning cup. The difference is borage actually helps your adrenal glands instead of overworking them. Medieval herbalists used it for everything from calming nerves to treating what they called melancholy. Today's research backs up their wisdom. Those gamma-linolenic acids support healthy inflammation response better than most modern alternatives. And the bees, they go absolutely crazy for borage flowers. Plant some and you'll have the happiest pollinators in the neighborhood buzzing around like they've found buried treasure. But borage isn't the only banned plant that supports your body's natural processes. Wait until you discover the next one that's been hiding in plain sight, disguised as something completely different. Your grandmother probably called it a weed and yanked it out of her garden without a second thought. But mallow? This unassuming plant was once the star of medieval kitchens and medicine cabinets alike. Here's the kicker. Mallow is literally where marshmallows got their name. The original marshmallows were made from the sap of mallow roots, not the sugar-packed fluff we roast over campfires today. Talk about a glow down that would make any influencer weep. Medieval cooks knew something we've forgotten. They tossed mallow leaves into stews and soups, creating dishes that didn't just fill bellies but actually healed them. The leaves contained something called mucilage, basically nature's own throat coat. Got a scratchy throat? Mallow beats those expensive lozenges hands down. But here's where big agriculture got nervous. Mallow spreads like gossip in a small town. It's what botanists politely call invasive, which really means it grows so well that it makes other crops look lazy. Can't have that when you're trying to sell expensive seeds every season, right? The roots were the real treasure, though. Medieval healers used them to make poultices that could soothe everything from burns to stomach ulcers. The mucilage creates a protective coating on your stomach lining like bubble wrap for your insides. Today's genetically modified vegetables promise enhanced nutrition, but they're missing something crucial. They lack the resilience that kept our ancestors alive during famines. Mallow kept growing when everything else failed. Speaking of resilience, there's another banned vegetable that thrived in the harshest coastal conditions. Sea kale might sound like something you'd find washed up on a beach after a storm, but medieval coastal communities treated this plant like underwater treasure. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Picture cabbage's sophisticated cousin who spent way too much time at the spa. That's sea kale for you. This maritime marvel thrived along rocky coastlines, giving farmers near the ocean a reliable crop that laughed at salty soil and harsh winds. While everyone else inland was babying their vegetables, coastal folks just let sea kale do its thing. But here's where it gets interesting. Sea kale packs more vitamin C than your morning orange juice and enough iodine to keep your thyroid happier than a retiree in Florida. Medieval sailors knew this stuff could prevent scurvy better than any fancy supplement big agriculture pushes today. The crazy part? Sea kale actually improves the land it grows on. Unlike modern crops that suck nutrients out faster than teenagers drain your bank account, this plant prevents soil erosion. It literally holds the coastline together while feeding people. Try getting that from your GMO broccoli. Then there's the taste factor. Raw, it's got this crisp, slightly salty bite that makes salads pop. Cooked, it transforms into something resembling the best parts of asparagus and spinach having a delicious baby. No wonder fancy restaurants started sneaking it back onto menus. Well, the ones that could find it anyway. See, sea kale's biggest crime was being too niche for mass production. You can't just plant this anywhere and expect miracles. But what happens when you need something even more specialized to survive harsh conditions? Ever seen a vegetable that looks like it belongs in a fancy restaurant but grows like a weed in your backyard? Meet the asparagus pea, the overachiever that got kicked out of modern farming for being too interesting. This little beauty produces pods that taste remarkably like asparagus, but here's the kicker, it's actually a legume. Think of it as nature's practical joke on botanists everywhere. While regular asparagus takes 3 years to establish and demands perfect soil conditions like a spoiled celebrity, asparagus peas grow faster than your neighbor's gossip spreads. The pods are downright gorgeous, too. Bright red flowers bloom into these winged, almost ornamental-looking pods that would make your Instagram followers think you've gone full fancy farmer. But big agriculture? They wanted nothing to do with something this photogenic. Why the cold shoulder? Well, asparagus peas don't fit into neat little shipping boxes. They're delicate, irregular, and require individual attention. Basically, the opposite of what industrial farming loves. Plus, they peak at exactly the right moment and won't wait around for your convenience. Here's what really gets me fired up about this plant. It actually improves soil quality while it grows. Unlike many GMO crops that drain nutrients faster than teenagers empty a refrigerator, asparagus peas fix nitrogen naturally. They're basically doing the soil a favor while producing food. The folate content rivals expensive supplements, and the fiber keeps your digestive system happier than a retiree with unlimited buffet access. Makes sense why medieval gardeners treasured these little gems, right? But there's one final vegetable that might surprise you even more. Most people rip chickweed out of their gardens like it's public enemy number one. But here's the kicker. Our medieval ancestors treated this weed like green gold. They knew something we've completely forgotten. Chickweed grows faster than gossip at a church potluck. Within just weeks of planting, you can harvest tender leaves that pack more vitamin C than your average orange. Makes sense why sailors used to gobble this stuff up to prevent scurvy, right? Well, big agriculture had other plans. They convinced everyone that chickweed was nothing but a troublesome pest. Meanwhile, they pushed their uniform crops that look pretty on store shelves but deliver about as much nutrition as cardboard. The weird part is, chickweed thrives everywhere. Poor soil? No problem. Drought conditions? It laughs in the face of dry weather. This little powerhouse contains saponins, natural compounds that act like nature's anti-inflammatory medicine. Medieval folks made poultices from it to treat wounds and skin problems. But why did we abandon such a reliable food source? Simple economics. You can't patent a weed that grows wild in every backyard. There's no money in telling people they can harvest free salad greens from their lawn. I've personally tried chickweed in salads, and it tastes like a cross between spinach and corn silk. Mild, slightly sweet, and surprisingly satisfying. The texture's tender enough that even my picky Uncle Larry would probably eat it without complaining. Then there's the sustainability factor. While GMO crops require fertilizers, pesticides, and constant babying, chickweed just grows. It's nature's way of saying, I've got this covered. Sometimes the best solutions are literally growing under our feet. Medieval battlefields weren't won by chivalry and shining armor. They were conquered by instruments of terrifying efficiency, each designed to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. Behind every victory stood not just brave knights, but the dark genius of weaponsmiths who transformed human fears into cold, hard metal. Let's start with the warhammer. This weapon embodied this brutal efficiency perfectly. Knights spent small fortunes on their plate armor, believing themselves nearly invincible on the battlefield. A well-crafted suit of armor could indeed turn away sword strikes and deflect arrows, leading many wealthy warriors to think they'd solved the problem of battlefield mortality. Then someone invented the warhammer, and suddenly that expensive metal shell became less protection and more of a personal coffin. Unlike swords that would harmlessly glance off plate armor, warhammers focused tremendous force into a small area. One solid hit could cave in a helmet and the skull underneath, without needing to penetrate the metal at all. The physics was brutal but effective. The energy had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was straight into the knight's brain. Knights probably thought they were getting the medieval equivalent of a tank, but ended up with something closer to a dinner bell. Ding! One crushed skull ready to serve. Many warhammers featured a wicked spike on the reverse side, turning the weapon into a versatile tool of destruction. Hammer side for crushing, spike side for puncturing. When your enemy wears a metal can, you simply need the right can opener. This design versatility made the warhammer a practical solution to the problem of heavily armored opponents. A knight might survive a sword blow thanks to his armor, but the concentrated force of a hammer strike transmitted through the metal would liquefy the tissue beneath. The horrifying sounds of a warhammer is connecting with a helmet, a distinctive crunch that signaled the end of a knight's career and often his life. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English men-at-arms used warhammers to devastating effect against French knights who had become stuck in the muddy battlefield. Unable to maneuver effectively, these knights found their expensive armor transforming from protection into a death trap. What made warhammers particularly democratic weapons of their day was their accessibility. You didn't need years of training like with a sword. You just needed enough strength to swing it and enough anger to aim it at someone you didn't like. This made them popular among common soldiers who couldn't afford extensive combat training. It was perhaps history's first example of user-friendly design, though the user manual would have been disturbingly brief. Pointy end toward enemy, swing hard. Archaeological findings have uncovered warhammers with heads weighing up to 7 pounds, a significant mass when swung at the end of a 3-foot handle. The resulting momentum could easily crush bone, even through plate armor that would have stopped a sword or an arrow. Some specimens found in Eastern European collections show signs of repeated impact, with hammer faces worn smooth from use, silent testimony to the weapon's effectiveness. Interestingly, as armor improved throughout the medieval period, so did the warhammer. Earlier versions were little more than modified tools, but later designs became increasingly specialized for combat. By the 15th century, some warhammers featured armor-piercing spikes, reinforced shafts, and specially designed striking surfaces meant to punch through even the finest Milan steel. It was an arms race in miniature. As armor got better, hammers got deadlier. Knights spent years training in the chivalric arts, mastering swordsmanship and lance techniques, only to be taken down by a commoner with what amounted to an upgraded tool. There was something profoundly democratic about it. No matter your social status or wealth, your skull was equally crushable when facing a determined opponent with a warhammer. While the warhammer excelled at dealing with armored opponents through brute force, medieval weaponsmiths were just getting started with their deadly innovations. One of them is the spiked metal ball attached to a wooden handle by a length of chain. The flail represented medieval weapon design at its most unpredictable. This weapon couldn't have been more different from the straightforward warhammer. It was temperamental, difficult to master, and refused to follow the laws of physics in the way more conventional weapons did. If the warhammer was the reliable workhorse of medieval combat, the flail was its moody artistic cousin with anger management issues. The basic design was deceptively simple. Take a wooden handle, attach a chain, and secure a metal ball covered in spikes to the other end. But this simplicity masked a weapon of terrifying complexity in actual use. The chain created a delay between the wielder's movement and the impact of the striking head, making timing extraordinarily difficult to master. Many medieval manuscripts describe the lengthy training required to use a flail effectively, with novices spending months learning to avoid striking themselves before ever facing an opponent. Medieval weapon instructors must have had the easiest job interviews. Self-injury was remarkably common among flail users. Historical records from military hospitals across medieval Europe document numerous injuries sustained during flail training. Modern experimental archaeologists attempting to master flail techniques have confirmed it, with many suffering bruises, lacerations, and even broken bones during practice sessions. The flail has the unique distinction of being the only medieval weapon with a confirmed kill count against its own users. A flail user needed to develop not just strength, but a keen spatial awareness and precise control over the weapon's momentum, or at least enough awareness to draft a will before practice sessions. Given these challenges, why would anyone choose such a difficult weapon? The answer lies in its unique advantages against the heavily armored opponents of the late medieval period. The flexible chain allowed the striking head to bypass shields and other defensive implements that would have stopped a rigid weapon like a sword or mace. A shield raised to block a flail could still result in the spiked ball wrapping around its edge to strike the defender. This unpredictability made the flail particularly effective against defensive fighters who relied on precise blocking techniques. Your shield technique is impeccable, Sir Knight. Anyway, here's a spiky surprise coming in from a completely different angle. The physics of the flail also gave it tremendous striking power. The chain acted as a force multiplier, creating a whip-like effect that concentrated energy into the striking head. Tests conducted on modern reproductions have shown that a flail can deliver up to 40% more force than a rigid weapon of similar weight. When this force was combined with the armor-piercing potential of the spikes, the result was a weapon capable of causing catastrophic injuries even to armored opponents. Medieval knights learned the hard way that momentum wasn't just a fancy physics term, it was what turned their expensive armor into an elaborate colander. Multiple variations of the flail existed throughout medieval Europe. The most common was the single-headed military flail with a spiked iron ball, but more exotic versions have been documented in historical texts and artwork. Some flails featured multiple chains and striking heads, transforming the already chaotic weapon into something even more unpredictable. Because nothing says, "I have a death wish," quite like doubling down on an already uncontrollable weapon. A particularly notorious variant from Eastern Europe incorporated small hollow chambers in the striking heads that produced a terrifying whistling sound when swung. This psychological weapon added an element of terror to an already fearsome device, disorienting opponents before impact. It was the medieval version of psychological warfare. Is that whistling sound getting closer? Or, oh, there's a hole in my helmet now. The flail gained a reputation as a weapon that required special countermeasures. Knights trained specifically to deal with flail wielders, learning to predict the arc of the striking head and time their movements to avoid its deadly impact. These specialized techniques highlight how seriously the threat of the flail was taken on medieval battlefields. While less common than swords or spears, flails occupied a special place in a knight's nightmare, a weapon whose movement could not be easily predicted or countered. Knights probably had PTSD flashbacks every time they heard a chain rattle or watched someone swing a bag of groceries. The flail's reputation extended beyond the battlefield. In several European regions, it became associated with peasant uprisings due to its agricultural origins. The military flail evolved from the grain flail, a farming tool used to separate grain from husks. During times of rebellion, peasants often modified these familiar tools into weapons, creating folk variants of the military flail. These makeshift weapons proved surprisingly effective against armored opponents, contributing to the success of several peasant revolts throughout the medieval period. Talk about workplace repurposing. One day you're threshing wheat, the next day you're threshing nobles. The Hussite rebels of 15th century Bohemia became particularly infamous for their effective use of flails against fully armored opponents. The unpredictable movement of the striking head made defensive maneuvers difficult to time correctly. Even experienced knights might find themselves hesitating in the face of a weapon that defied standard defensive tactics. This moment of hesitation could prove fatal on the battlefield, where split-second decisions often determine survival. The flail created existential crises on the battlefield. Is the spiked ball coming at my face, or wait, where did it go? Oh, there it is, somehow behind me. While the warhammer brought direct crushing force to deal with armored opponents, the flail introduced an element of chaos that even the most heavily armored knight had reason to fear. But for all its unpredictability, the flail still required a trained warrior to wield it effectively. Other weapons would emerge that placed deadly force. The Godendag, a Flemish term meaning good day, represents one of history's most effective examples of straightforward weapon design. This unassuming weapon changed the course of medieval warfare by placing deadly power in the hands of common soldiers. At first glance, a Godendag appears almost primitive, a stout wooden club with a single metal spike protruding from the end. Nothing about its appearance suggests the revolutionary impact it would have on European battlefields. Yet this simple design concealed a tactical versatility that made it devastating against even the most heavily armored opponents. The effectiveness of the Godendag stemmed from its dual-purpose design. The spike could puncture armor or unseat mounted knights, while the heavy club portion delivered crushing blows to opponents who had been knocked to the ground. This combination made it the perfect weapon for foot soldiers facing armored cavalry, a common scenario in medieval warfare. The weapon's defining moment came at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, commonly known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. On July 11th of that year, an army of Flemish townspeople and peasants faced a force of French knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The French were so confident of victory that they brought along a special wagon filled with ropes to bind their expected prisoners. What happened next shocked the medieval world. The Flemish militia, armed primarily with Godendags, utterly destroyed the French knights. The battlefield was so littered with golden spurs, a symbol of knighthood, that the conflict gained its alternative name. How did an army of commoners defeat Europe's premier fighting force? The genius of the Godendag lay in its application against mounted knights. Flemish fighters developed a specific technique: brace the base of the weapon against the ground, pointing the spike upward toward an oncoming horse. The charging knight, carried forward by his own momentum, would impale either himself or his mount on the spike. Once dismounted, the knight became vulnerable to the club end of the weapon, which could crush skulls even through helmets. This battle revealed a harsh truth about medieval warfare. Even the most sophisticated armor and years of training could be undone by a determined opponent with the right tool. The Godendag cost perhaps 1/50th the price of a knight's equipment, yet proved more decisive on that bloody field. Military historians mark Courtrai as the beginning of the end for the dominance of heavy cavalry in European warfare. Surviving examples of Godendags show remarkable variation in size and design. Some featured shorter handles for tight formation fighting, while others extended to nearly 6 feet in length for front-rank troops. The spike might be short and pyramidal or long and slender, depending on its intended use against different types of armor. This variation suggests that, despite its simple appearance, the Godendag underwent continuous refinement based on battlefield experience. For centuries, knights had cultivated an image of martial superiority, with elaborate codes of combat and expensive equipment serving as barriers to entry for common soldiers. The Godendag shattered this mystique by proving that a simple weapon in trained hands could overcome aristocratic advantages. After Courtrai, chronicles record a notable change in how nobles spoke about infantry, with newfound respect tinged with fear. Manufacturing a Godendag required minimal resources and expertise compared to more complex weapons. A village blacksmith could produce the metal spike, while any competent woodworker could fashion the club portion. This accessibility made it possible for entire communities to arm themselves quickly during times of conflict. During the Flemish revolt against French rule, historical records indicate that towns could outfit hundreds of militia members with these weapons in a matter of weeks. The Godendag also influenced military training methods. Unlike swords or flails that required years to master, effective use of the Godendag could be taught to recruits in days. Military documents from the period describe drilling formations of Godendog wielders to create an interlocking wall of spikes against cavalry charges. This standardized training transformed groups of individual fighters into coordinated units capable of standing against mounted knights. The weapon's legacy extends beyond the medieval period. The concept of combining piercing and crushing elements in a single infantry weapon influenced polearm design for centuries. Later weapons like the halberd and poleaxe incorporated similar principles, but with more elaborate construction. Even as these more sophisticated designs emerged, the Godendog remained in use among militia forces well into the 16th century, a testament to its enduring effectiveness. The rise of firearms would eventually render most medieval melee weapons obsolete, including the Godendog. Yet this simple weapon had already changed warfare by proving that technological advantage didn't always require complexity or expense. Sometimes the most revolutionary tools are also the most straightforward, a lesson that military innovators continue to rediscover. While the Godendog empowered common soldiers with its simplicity, other medieval weapons took the opposite approach. The Zweihänder embodied extravagant excess. This enormous two-handed sword dominated battlefields through its sheer imposing presence and the devastating power it delivered in the hands of skilled warriors. If the warhammer was medieval problem-solving through brute force and the flail was medieval chaos theory in action, the Zweihänder was medieval overcompensation in weapon form. Zweihänder translates from German as two-hander, a straightforward name for a weapon that was anything but simple. These massive swords measured between 5 and 6 feet long, with some exceptional specimens reaching nearly 7 feet. The blade alone could extend over 4 feet, with a grip long enough to accommodate both hands with room to spare. These weren't just big swords, they were portable siege weapons disguised as blades. When your sword is taller than most of the people you're fighting, you're not just making a statement about your combat style, but possibly compensating for something else entirely. The weight of a typical Zweihänder ranged from 7 to 14 pounds, with most battlefield versions falling closer to the lighter end of that spectrum. This might not sound particularly heavy until you consider the exhaustion of swinging such a weapon repeatedly during combat. Modern martial arts tests with authentic Zweihänders have shown that even trained athletes struggle to maintain effective fighting form for more than a few minutes. The physical demands placed on historical users must have been extraordinary. These warriors didn't need two hands just because the manual said so. They needed them because otherwise their arms would have fallen off after the third swing. German mercenaries known as Landsknechts specialized in wielding these enormous weapons. These professional soldiers emerged in the late 15th century and quickly gained a reputation as some of Europe's most effective fighters. Within Landsknecht formations, Zweihänder wielders received double pay due to the skill and strength required to use the weapon effectively, earning them the title Doppelsöldner, or double pay men. This financial incentive drew the biggest and strongest recruits to train with the massive swords. Medieval job descriptions didn't get more straightforward. Must have 2 functioning hands, forearms like tree trunks, and a complete disregard for reasonable weapon proportions. Double salary, triple food rations. Primary sources describe the specialized role these sword wielders played on the battlefield. Rather than fighting in conventional formations, Zweihänder users often operated as formation breakers, charging directly into opposing pike squares to disrupt their cohesion. The long reach of the Zweihänder allowed its user to cut through multiple pike shafts with a single powerful swing, creating gaps that could be exploited by following troops. Pike formations, previously considered nearly impenetrable, suddenly had a counterweapon to fear. Imagine the horror of watching someone charge your impenetrable formation with what amounted to a 6-foot razor blade. It was like bringing a metal tree to a stick fight. The design of the Zweihänder evolved significantly throughout its service life. Early versions resembled oversized longswords, but later models incorporated specialized features for battlefield effectiveness. Most notable was the addition of a ricasso, an unsharpened section of blade just above the crossguard, often wrapped in leather to provide an additional gripping surface. This feature allowed for more controlled handling, with the wielder placing one hand on the grip and the other on the ricasso for leverage in close combat. When your sword is so big it needs its own handle halfway up the blade, you might have taken the two hands concept a bit too literally. Many Zweihanders also featured parrying hooks or flukes projecting from the blade near the crossguard. These secondary guards served multiple purposes. They protected the user's hands, provided additional leverage for controlling an opponent's weapon, and could be used to trap and disarm enemies during combat. These hooks transformed the sword from a pure cutting tool into a multi-purpose battlefield implement that could slash, thrust, hook, and trap enemy weapons. It was the medieval Swiss army knife, if that knife were 6 feet long and required Olympic-level strength to lift. One military observer noted how enemy formations would visibly recoil at the approach of Landsknechts carrying these enormous swords. The distinctive profile of the Zweihander, especially when carried upright with the blade resting on the shoulder, created an impression of superhuman warriors that could demoralize opponents before battle even began. Half the battle was psychological. When you see someone casually resting what looks like an entire blacksmith shop on their shoulder, running in the opposite direction suddenly seems like a career-enhancing move. Training with the Zweihander required specialized techniques unlike those used with smaller swords. Surviving fighting manuals illustrate specific stances and movements designed to manage the weapon's momentum rather than fight against it. Users learned to flow from one strike to another, maintaining constant motion to avoid becoming vulnerable during recovery. A properly trained Zweihander wielder moved with a dancer's precision, transforming the unwieldy blade into an extension of their body. Medieval Zweihander training manuals likely began with an important disclaimer. Results may vary based on how many times you've skipped arm day. At the Battle of Bicaka in 1522, Landsknechts armed with Zweihanders carved paths through dense Swiss pike formations that had previously been considered unbreakable. The psychological shock of seeing their invincible pike walls devastated by these enormous swords contributed to a significant Swiss defeat and marked a turning point in infantry tactics. The Swiss pikemen learned an important lesson that day. When the enemy brings a sword so big it needs its own zip code, your unbreakable formation is about to experience some unscheduled renovations. Despite their effectiveness, Zweihanders remained specialist weapons rather than standard issue equipment. The extensive training requirements, physical demands, and material costs limited their distribution to elite troops. A quality Zweihander required significant quantities of high-grade steel and the skills of master swordsmiths, making them expensive investments even for well-funded mercenary companies. When your weapon costs as much as a small house and requires the muscle development of a professional athlete, mass production isn't really an option. These massive swords remained in active military use longer than might be expected, with documented battlefield deployments continuing into the early 17th century, well into the age of firearms. This longevity speaks to their continued effectiveness even as military technology evolved around them. The Zweihander found particular use in defending narrow passages like breaches in city walls, where their long reach and devastating cutting power could hold back multiple attackers. Nothing said, "This doorway is closed," quite like a man with a sword the size of a small tree standing in the breach. Surviving examples display remarkable craftsmanship alongside their intimidating dimensions. Museum specimens often feature elaborate etching, gilded inscriptions, and complex hilts that showcase the prestige associated with these weapons. The classic Zweihander silhouette became a status symbol among mercenary companies, with ornately decorated examples serving as parade weapons and symbols of unit pride. Some were so elaborately decorated that they probably spent more time being admired than used in battle, the medieval equivalent of that sports car that never leaves the garage. While the Zweihander represented the height of offensive capability through sheer size and reach, medieval weapon designers also created specialized tools for more selective battlefield tasks. Medieval battlefields were not always about killing. Sometimes capturing an opponent alive offered far greater rewards than simply adding another body to the pile. Enter the man-catcher, a weapon specifically designed not to end lives, but to ensure prisoners remained both alive and compliant. Because sometimes killing your enemies wasn't enough, you needed to invoice them afterward. Unlike the massive Zweihander that announced its deadly purpose with every swing, the man-catcher operated on a principle of cruel efficiency. The basic design consisted of a long pole topped with a hinged metal collar lined with inward-facing spikes or barbs. When placed around an opponent's neck or limb and closed, these spikes prevented escape without causing immediate fatal injuries. Medieval engineers had essentially created a portable, instant prison cell on a stick, proof that catch and release was never part of the medieval combat philosophy. The economics of medieval warfare made the man-catcher an extremely practical tool. Knights and nobles represented significant financial investments, both in their equipment and in their potential ransom value. A dead knight yielded only his armor and weapons as spoils. A captured knight, however, could bring a fortune in ransom money. Historical records show ransoms reaching astronomical sums, with some high-ranking nobles commanding payments equivalent to several years' worth of a town's tax revenue. One particularly valuable French noble captured during the 100 Years' War was ransomed for the modern equivalent of $6 million. Medieval accountants had figured out something important. Dead knights were a one-time transaction, but live ones were recurring revenue streams. Operating a man-catcher required less strength than weapons like the warhammer or Zweihänder, but demanded precise timing and positioning. Users were trained to target mounted opponents, using the long reach of the pole to snare a knight's neck or limb and then twist to unseat them from their horse. Once on the ground, an armored knight became surprisingly vulnerable, weighted down by the very equipment meant to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on medieval soldiers. Nothing says, "Your protection has become your prison," quite like watching a nobleman waddle helplessly in his own custom-fitted metal cage. The weapon proved particularly effective against helmet designs that protected the face but restricted peripheral vision, allowing man-catcher wielders to approach from angles their targets couldn't easily monitor. For all the elaborate engineering of medieval headgear, someone forgot the simple check your blind spots feature that might have prevented many a knight from becoming an unwilling participant in medieval catch and carry. Regional variations reflected different tactical needs. Germanic versions typically featured longer poles for safely reaching mounted opponents, while Mediterranean variants incorporated elaborate catching mechanisms, including spring-loaded components. Some advanced designs included secondary mechanisms that could tighten the collar further after initial capture, ensuring that struggling only increased the prisoner's discomfort. Medieval weaponsmiths had effectively invented the quit struggling or it gets worse principle long before modern restraint technology. Using man-catchers required specialized team tactics rather than individual prowess. Military manuscripts describe formations of 3 to 5 soldiers working together to capture high-value targets. One soldier would manage the man-catcher itself, while others provided protection and helped secure the prisoner once captured. These capture teams became highly valued units within medieval armies, receiving bonus payments for successfully taking important enemies alive. They were the medieval equivalent of repo men, except instead of taking your cart for missed payments, they took you for missed battlefield victories. The weapon found particular favor among forces tasked with urban security and riot control. City watch units from Venice to London maintained man-catchers as standard equipment for apprehending criminals in crowded streets. Their ability to control an opponent without necessarily causing fatal injuries made them ideal for situations where indiscriminate killing might spark broader unrest. Medieval catch-and-release programs had a very different meaning than today's fishing regulations. Nobles attempting to avoid capture developed specific countermeasures against man-catchers. Some knight orders modified their armor to include reinforced collars that prevented the weapon from gaining purchase around the neck. Others trained specifically to recognize and counter man-catcher wielders on the battlefield, targeting them as priority threats. Nothing motivated innovation quite like the prospect of being paraded home in a neck collar while your family sold the summer castle to pay your ransom. Unlike many medieval weapons that became obsolete with the advent of firearms, man-catchers maintained practical utility even as battlefield technology evolved. Their ability to control opponents at a distance without killing them fulfilled a need that guns could not. Modified versions appeared in law enforcement contexts well into the 19th century, particularly in regions where controlling suspects without firearms remained a priority. When your weapon doubled as an ATM withdrawal tool for enemy noblemen, you made sure to keep it in good working order. As we shift from the careful restraint of the man-catcher to our next weapon, we enter the realm of medieval combat where mercy was never part of the design specifications. The Morning Star represented medieval brutality distilled into its purest form, a heavy metal ball covered in spikes designed to deliver catastrophic damage with every strike. If nightmares could be forged in iron, they'd look exactly like this. The name Morning Star comes from the weapon's visual resemblance to the planet Venus. The bright morning star, when fitted with its characteristic metal spikes radiating outward from the central core. The poetic name stands in stark contrast to its decidedly unpoetic function on the battlefield. Medieval warriors had a peculiar talent for giving beautiful names to absolutely horrifying weapons. This particular star didn't grant wishes so much as ensure your enemies wouldn't be making any more of their own. Unlike its cousin the flail, the Morning Star had no chain connecting the striking head to the handle. This direct attachment made it far more reliable and easier to control in the chaos of combat, turning your average nightmare into a precision-guided bad dream. A typical Morning Star consisted of three main components: a wooden shaft for gripping, a metal mounting system, and the spiked striking head. This head could range from a relatively modest 3-inch diameter with half-inch spikes to massive versions spanning 6 inches across with spikes extending 2 to 3 inches from the surface. The largest specimens recovered from European battlefields weigh upwards of 10 pounds, heavy enough to shatter bones even without the added trauma of the spikes. When your weapon is essentially a medieval porcupine on a stick, subtlety was never going to be part of the design philosophy. The physics behind the Morning Star made it devastatingly effective against armored opponents. The weapon concentrated tremendous force into the small contact points represented by each spike tip. When swung against plate armor, these spikes could punch through metal that would have turned aside sword cuts or even direct hammer blows. The resulting wounds were notoriously difficult to treat with medieval medical techniques, leading to high mortality rates even among knights who survived the initial combat. This spike nightmare didn't just hurt you, it ensured medieval surgeons would have nightmares of their own trying to patch you up afterward. Archaeological evidence reveals the Morning Star's grim effectiveness. Skeletal remains from medieval battle sites show distinctive patterns of trauma associated with these weapons, clustered puncture wounds with massive underlying bone fractures. Medieval battlefield injuries could often be identified by weapon type, with Morning Star victims being perhaps the only soldiers in history who died from an acute case of too many holes. The Morning Star didn't just kill, it left a calling card that archaeologists could identify centuries later. The Morning Star required less technical skill than weapons like the sword or flail, but demanded considerable upper body strength to wield effectively. Military training manuals from the period recommend specific exercises to build the necessary shoulder and arm power, including practice swings with progressively heavier training versions. Once mastered, however, the Morning Star offered devastating returns on this investment of training time, particularly against well-armored opponents. The Morning Star was the medieval equivalent of that gym membership you actually use, except the results weren't just impressive biceps, but impressive body counts. Tactical applications varied across different military contexts. Mounted knights favored shorter-handled versions that could be wielded from horseback, delivering devastating overhead strikes augmented by the rider's elevated position and the horse's momentum. Infantry formations typically employed longer shafted variants that could be swung in wide arcs to clear space around the wielder or thrust forward like impromptu spears when necessary. This versatility made the Morning Star a surprisingly adaptable nightmare, capable of ruining someone's day from multiple positions and distances. The psychological impact of facing Morning Star armed troops should not be underestimated. The weapon was particularly fear-inducing, with its distinctive profile triggering primal fears even in seasoned warriors. This psychological effect became a tactical advantage, with some military leaders deliberately positioning Morning Star wielders at the front of formations to demoralize opponents before contact was even made. Nothing says, perhaps we should reconsider this battle, quite like facing a line of soldiers carrying what appear to be medieval torture devices with handles. Variations of the Morning Star appeared across Europe and Asia, with regional designs reflecting local military traditions and manufacturing capabilities. Eastern European versions featured more numerous but shorter spikes optimized for penetrating the lighter armor common in those regions. Western European designs incorporated fewer but longer spikes, specifically engineered to defeat high-quality plate armor. The Spike Nightmare proved adaptable enough to evolve alongside armor technology, ensuring no protective gear could provide sweet dreams when facing this weapon. Religious imagery sometimes incorporated the Morning Star in unexpected ways. Medieval artwork occasionally depicts angels wielding these weapons against demons, suggesting that even divine retribution might require spiked implements. This religious association gave rise to the weapon's alternative name in some regions, the holy water sprinkler, a grimly humorous reference to the blood spray produced when the weapon found its mark. Medieval humor tended toward the macabre, and nothing says, "Go with God," quite like a face full of metal spikes. These weapons offered a form of last rites that came with complimentary dental work, though few patients survived to appreciate their new smile. The legacy of the Morning Star extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive silhouette became a visual shorthand for brutality in medieval artwork, appearing in depictions of hell and divine punishment. This visual association was so strong that morning stars were sometimes mounted above city gates or government buildings as warnings against lawbreaking, serving as three-dimensional symbols of authority's power to inflict punishment. While other medieval weapons might eventually be forgotten, this spiked nightmare continues to haunt our collective imagination as the definitive symbol of medieval brutality. While the Morning Star represented direct and unsubtle violence, medieval weapon designers also created more specialized tools. The bec de corbin represented a thoughtful approach to the problem of killing armored opponents. Its name, French for raven's beak, perfectly described its most distinctive feature, a wickedly curved spike resembling a bird's beak, designed specifically to punch through plate armor with terrifying efficiency. The bec de corbin belongs to the polearm family of weapons, those mounted on long wooden shafts to provide reach and leverage. What set this particular polearm apart was its versatile head design, which incorporated multiple weapon types into a single lethal package. On one side sat the namesake spike or beak, curved downward and tapered to a sharp point. The opposite side typically featured a hammerhead for delivering crushing blows. Many versions also included a straight spike extending from the top, allowing for thrusting attacks similar to a spear. This 3-in-1 design made the bec de corbin the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife, though its functions were limited to various methods of inflicting grievous harm. Knights who carried one never had to worry about bringing the wrong tool to a fight. It was the battlefield multitasker that asked the important question, how would you prefer your armor penetrated today? Pierced, crushed, or skewered? A skilled wielder could alternate between piercing, crushing, and thrusting attacks without changing weapons, responding to different armor types and combat situations with remarkable flexibility. Medieval combat manuals describe specific techniques for each attack form, suggesting that warriors trained extensively to make full use of the weapon's versatility. The physics behind the bec de corbin's effectiveness stemmed from simple mechanical advantage. The long wooden shaft, typically 5 to 7 feet in length, created a lever that multiplied the wielder's striking force. When that amplified force was concentrated into the small contact point of the beak or top spike, the pressure could exceed 4,000 pounds per square inch, more than enough to penetrate even the finest plate armor. For context, modern ballistic tests have shown that most medieval plate armor could withstand pressures of around 2,000 pounds per square inch before failing. The distinctive sound was made when a bec de corbin punched through plate armor, a high-pitched screech followed by a dull thud as the spike penetrated the underlying body. Some military chroniclers noted that experienced soldiers could distinguish this sound on the battlefield and recognized it as a particularly bad omen for the recipient. When you heard that noise, someone had just received a special delivery courtesy of the Raven's Beak Postal Service. No signature required, delivery confirmed. Training with the bec de corbin demanded more technical skill than many other medieval weapons. The weapon's weight distribution made it unwieldy for beginners, requiring months of practice to master. Military treatises from the period recommend specific progressive training regimens, beginning with basic strikes against stationary targets and advancing to complex combination attacks against moving opponents. Knights who mastered these techniques became particularly feared on the battlefield, able to defeat heavily armored opponents who might have been nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The bec de corbin found particular favor among foot soldiers tasked with fighting mounted knights. The weapon's length allowed infantry to strike riders from a relatively safe distance, while the specialized head design could either unseat the knight or deliver fatal blows through armor. Military records from several major late medieval battles credit infantry armed with these weapons for defeating previously dominant heavy cavalry forces. The Battle of Courtrai in 1302 saw Flemish infantry armed with similar polearms defeat the elite French heavy cavalry, fundamentally changing medieval warfare by proving that well-equipped foot soldiers could overcome mounted knights. Manufacturing a quality bec de corbin required collaboration between specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged the complex head, carefully hardening the striking surfaces while maintaining enough flexibility in the socket to prevent breaking under impact. Woodworkers selected ash or oak shafts, paying careful attention to the grain pattern to ensure the pole could withstand the tremendous forces involved in combat. The joining of head to shaft represented a particularly critical manufacturing step, with high-quality examples featuring reinforced sockets and additional strapping to prevent separation during use. The distinctive silhouette, particularly the curved beak, created an ominous impression even before combat began. The intimidating sight of infantry formations bristling with these weapons, their curved beaks catching the light like rows of predatory birds waiting to strike. For knights who had spent fortunes on armor they believed would protect them, the sight of weapons specifically designed to defeat that protection proved particularly demoralizing. It was like watching someone approach your brand new state-of-the-art security door with the exact specialized key you were told didn't exist. All that money spent on armor, and these infantry soldiers were walking around with what amounted to Nightkin Openers Special Edition. Regional variations of the bec de corbin reflected different military traditions and tactical needs. Italian versions typically featured longer, more slender beaks optimized for penetrating the high-quality plate armor produced in Milan and other Italian manufacturing centers. French designs often incorporated broader hammer faces, creating a better balance between piercing and crushing capabilities. Eastern European variants sometimes included additional hooks or tines, allowing the weapon to be used for disarming opponents or pulling riders from horseback. The weapon remained in active military use for an impressively long period, with documented battlefield deployments spanning from the late 13th century through the early 16th century. This longevity speaks to its fundamental effectiveness against armored opponents, even as armor design continuously evolved in response to such weapons. The ongoing arms race between armor and anti-armor weapons drove innovation on both sides, with each new defensive improvement spurring corresponding offensive adjustments. The legacy of the bec de corbin extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive head design influenced later polearm development, with elements appearing in weapons used well into the age of firearms. Modern tactical entry tools used by law enforcement and military forces incorporate similar design principles, particularly in breaching tools that combine piercing, prying, and striking functions in single implements. The fundamental concept, a versatile weapon head mounted on a leverage-enhancing shaft, proved so effective that its core principles remain relevant in specialized equipment today. While the bec de corbin represented the height of hand-to-hand anti-armor technology, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons that could deliver death from much greater distances. The ballista marked humanity's first serious attempt to solve warfare's oldest problem: how to kill people who are inconveniently far away. While the bec de corbin allowed warriors to strike armored opponents at arm's length, the ballista extended that reach to hundreds of yards. This massive weapon essentially scaled up the humble crossbow to terrifying proportions, creating a siege engine capable of punching through multiple armored soldiers with a single shot. At its core, the ballista operated on a simple principle: store energy in twisted skeins of animal sinew or rope, then release it explosively to propel a large projectile. The resulting weapon could launch bolts weighing up to 26 pounds at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. These projectiles carried enough momentum to penetrate shields, armor, and multiple bodies in a single shot. Unlike arrows that rained down in predictable arcs, ballista bolts traveled in relatively flat trajectories at speeds too fast for the human eye to track effectively. Soldiers described the terrifying experience of watching comrades suddenly impaled by massive bolts that seemed to materialize without warning. This invisible death from afar created a unique form of battlefield anxiety. You might survive a sword fight through skill, but avoiding a ballista bolt came down to nothing but luck. Medieval troops called this God's dice, though the deity they referenced likely wasn't the one they prayed to on Sundays. Operating a ballista required specialized training and typically a crew of at least 3 to 5 soldiers. One soldier aimed the weapon, while others managed the winding mechanism that tensioned the skein. A well-trained crew could achieve firing rates of 2 to 3 shots per minute. Not rapid fire by modern standards, but fast enough to create havoc in tightly packed formations. These crews developed their own specialized vocabulary and techniques, becoming highly valued specialists within medieval armies. Their status reflected a harsh battlefield truth. A single well-placed ballista could inflict more casualties than dozens of conventional fighters. Size variations existed throughout the medieval period, ranging from cart-mounted versions that required just 2 crew members to massive fixed emplacements demanding teams of 8 or more. The largest documented examples could launch projectiles weighing over 100 pounds, though these behemoths typically fired stones rather than bolts and functioned more like artillery than oversized crossbows. These larger variants stayed in active military use well into the age of early firearms, proving effective long after many other medieval weapons had been relegated to museum displays. The ballista represented an early form of force multiplication, allowing a small number of soldiers to project lethal power far beyond their individual capabilities. While impressive in its range and penetrating power, the ballista still focused primarily on targeting individual soldiers or small groups. Medieval military engineers, however, were just getting started with their long-distance killing innovations. The Scorpion earned its name honestly, quick, deadly, and with a sting you never saw coming. While the ballista excelled at penetrating multiple targets with massive bolts, the Scorpion prioritized speed and accuracy over raw power. This lighter, more mobile torsion weapon could be repositioned quickly on the battlefield, allowing medieval armies to respond to developing threats with precisely targeted death from distances that seemed almost magical to medieval soldiers. Originally developed by Roman engineers, the Scorpion disappeared during the early medieval period, only to be rediscovered and improved upon during the Crusades. The weapon's key innovation lay in its dual torsion bundles, twisted skeins of animal sinew or human hair that stored tremendous energy. When released, these bundles propelled a dart-like projectile with enough force to penetrate shields and armor at ranges exceeding 400 yards. Medieval armies basically rediscovered that you can solve most military problems by finding new ways to hurl pointy objects at your enemies really, really fast. The Scorpion was just particularly good at making sure those pointy objects reached exactly the right person at the wrong time in their day. What made the Scorpion particularly feared was its accuracy. Skilled operators could target specific individuals on the battlefield, making it the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. Medieval soldiers quickly learned to fear these weapons, as death could come without warning from an enemy too distant to even identify clearly. One moment you'd be shouting orders to your troops, the next moment explaining yourself at the pearly gates with a large hole where your previous career plans used to be. A well-trained Scorpion team achieved remarkable firing rates, up to 10 bolts per minute, in the hands of elite operators. This combination of rate of fire, accuracy, and penetrating power made the Scorpion disproportionately influential on the battlefield. Military historians estimate that during the Siege of Acre in 1191, fewer than 30 Scorpion teams accounted for over 800 casualties among the defending forces. The defenders' morning roll call became less about who was present and more about who hadn't been ventilated overnight. The psychological impact extended beyond the casualties inflicted. Defenders forced to man walls under Scorpion fire suffered severe morale problems. The knowledge that at any moment an unseen projectile could end your life created what medieval chronicles described as the waiting death, a paralyzing anxiety that undermined defensive efforts more effectively than direct attacks. This psychological warfare aspect made the Scorpion a valuable siege weapon even when its physical damage to structures remained limited. Some besieged cities even reported cases of Scorpion fever, a nervous condition where defenders constantly ducked at shadows and flinched at every sound. Nothing ruins your concentration quite like wondering if your head is about to become the next pincushion for a projectile fired by someone who might be enjoying lunch while they shoot at you. While the Scorpion brought precision death from unprecedented distances, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons of truly massive destructive potential. If medieval siege weaponry had a royal family, the trebuchet would sit on the throne. This colossal engine of destruction represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-gunpowder artillery, capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over incredible distances with devastating effect. Where the scorpion killed with precision, the trebuchet killed with raw, overwhelming force. The trebuchet operated on a counterweight system that would make any physics teacher proud. A massive weight, often exceeding 7,000 pounds, hung from the short end of a long wooden arm. When this weight dropped, it forced the longer end of the arm upward at tremendous speed, launching whatever projectile happened to be loaded in its sling. This simple mechanism could propel a 200-pound stone over 300 meters with enough force to shatter castle walls upon impact. Castle architects who thought they'd built impenetrable fortifications discovered the hard way that their unbreakable walls were merely not yet broken. The trebuchet had a way of transforming even the most confident castle defender into an anxious house hunter. Medieval engineering reached its zenith in these massive weapons. The largest documented trebuchets required teams of up to 60 men to operate and could launch projectiles weighing over 300 pounds. Contemporary accounts describe the earth-shaking impact of these massive stones, with one chronicler noting that a direct hit on a tower reduced it to dust and splinters as if it had never existed. Castle dwellers learned to dread the distinctive creaking sound of a trebuchet being winched back. It was the medieval equivalent of hearing a bomb bay door opening directly above your home. Trebuchet ammunition showed medieval creativity at its most disturbingly innovative. While stones remained the standard projectile, besieging armies often got creative when psychological warfare seemed advantageous. Historical records document trebuchets launching diseased animal carcasses, severed human heads, and even live prisoners into besieged cities. One particularly notorious incident during the siege of Kaffa in 1347 involved catapulting plague victims over the walls, possibly contributing to the spread of the Black Death into Europe. Medieval biological warfare lacked subtlety, but certainly made an impression. Nothing says surrender now quite like having your neighbor's deceased relative raining down from the sky. The exceptional range and power of these weapons transformed siege warfare. Before the trebuchet, defenders behind strong walls could reasonably expect to outlast most besiegers. After its introduction, no wall was truly safe, no fortress truly secure. This psychological advantage often proved as valuable as the physical damage inflicted, with many cities surrendering at the mere sight of trebuchets being assembled outside their walls. When your enemy started building what looked like an enormous wooden middle finger pointed at your fortifications, it was usually time to reconsider your life choices. While these 10 weapons represent the height of medieval military technology, they also reveal how human ingenuity has always found expression even in the art of warfare. From simple clubs with spikes to massive engines of destruction, the evolution of these weapons tells a story of innovation driven by one of humanity's oldest and darkest activities. If I told you the Romans had the internet, you'd laugh. But they had something eerily similar, and 12 other technologies that make our smart devices look primitive. The most shocking part? We actually downgraded after Rome fell. Ready to feel embarrassed about living in the most advanced era in history? Let's see what we really lost. When the Romans needed to bring fresh water to their cities, they didn't just dig wells and hope for the best. They built some of the most impressive engineering marvels the world had ever seen. Aqueducts that carried water across impossible distances using nothing but gravity and genius. These weren't your average garden hoses. We're talking about stone and brick channels that stretched for over 50 miles, crossing valleys and climbing hills like ancient superhighways for water. The Romans mixed their own waterproof cement that was so good it put some modern concrete to shame. No electric pumps, no fancy machinery, just pure physics and determination. Here's the crazy part. They managed to raise water to multi-story buildings, fill massive public baths, and supply countless fountains throughout their cities. All of this happened nearly 2,000 years ago when most of the world was still figuring out basic plumbing. The precision required was mind-blowing. A tiny miscalculation in the slope and the whole system would fail. But the Romans didn't just build these things to last a few decades, they built them for eternity. Some aqueducts are still functioning today, delivering water just like they did when toga-wearing engineers first switched them on. That's 2 millennia of continuous service without a single software update or maintenance call. The engineering behind these water highways required mathematical calculations that would make modern engineers sweat. Every arch, every gradient, every turn had to be perfect. Makes you wonder what else they figured out that we're still trying to match today. Speaking of things that lasted forever, the Romans didn't stop at bringing clean water into their cities. They also had to figure out how to get the dirty stuff out. While Rome's aqueducts brought clean water into the city, someone had to figure out how to get all that dirty water back out again. Enter the Cloaca Maxima, which sounds fancy, but basically means the really big drain. This massive sewer system became one of Rome's most important pieces of infrastructure, even though nobody wanted to talk about it at dinner parties. Built around the 6th century BC, this underground network started as a simple drainage ditch to keep the Forum from turning into a swamp. But Romans being Romans, they couldn't leave well enough alone. They expanded it into a sprawling system of stone tunnels that could handle both rainwater and human waste from across the city. The main tunnel was so big you could literally row a boat through it. Some of these passages were 12 feet wide and over 10 feet tall. Workers built them using massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, creating arches that distributed weight perfectly. The engineering was so solid that major portions still function today, nearly 2,000 years later. Here's the brilliant part, though. The system prevented both floods and disease outbreaks that plagued other ancient cities. When heavy rains hit Rome, water had somewhere to go instead of backing up into streets and homes. Meanwhile, waste got carried away from populated areas instead of festering in the summer heat. The Cloaca Maxima emptied directly into the Tiber River, which wasn't great for downstream neighbors, but kept Rome itself surprisingly clean. This massive drainage network became the template for urban sanitation systems across the empire and eventually inspired modern city planning. But staying warm and comfortable required completely different Roman innovations that worked underground in an entirely different way. After building massive aqueducts to bring water into Roman cities, engineers faced another challenge. How do you keep everyone warm during brutal winters? Well, they invented something that would make modern heating contractors jealous. The Hipparcos system was basically ancient central heating, but way cooler than anything your house has. Romans figured out how to heat entire buildings using nothing but fire, stone, and some seriously clever engineering. No electric fans, no gas furnaces, no complicated thermostats that nobody knows how to program. Here's how it worked. They'd build a furnace outside the building and burn wood or charcoal in it. Hot air and smoke would travel through a network of channels built right into the walls and under the floors. The floors were raised on small stone pillars, creating a hollow space underneath where the hot air could flow freely. These heated floors would warm the rooms above, turning freezing stone buildings into cozy living spaces. But the Romans didn't stop there. They also built vertical channels inside the walls themselves, letting hot air rise up and warm multiple floors. The whole system worked purely on the natural flow of hot air. No pumps, no electricity, just physics doing its thing. Roman bathhouses used hypocausts to create different temperature zones. You could move from a cool room to progressively hotter areas, just like a modern spa. Some wealthy Romans even had hypocausts in their private homes, which was basically the ancient equivalent of having a luxury heating system. The crazy part? Some hypocaust systems in Europe still work today, nearly 2,000 years later. That's Roman engineering for you. Speaking of Roman durability, wait until you hear what they did with flowing water to power entire industries. While Romans mastered moving water through their incredible aqueducts, they discovered something equally brilliant about harnessing that flowing water for actual work. Enter the water wheel, basically the ancient world's answer to free labor that never complained or asked for breaks. These weren't your backyard decorative wheels either. Roman engineers built massive wooden contraptions that could tower 20 feet high, positioned strategically along rivers and streams. The concept was beautifully simple. Flowing water hits the paddles, wheel turns, and suddenly you've got serious rotational power to work with. The real genius lay in wheel design. Undershot wheels sat partially in the water, getting pushed by the current flowing beneath them. But here's where Romans got clever. Overshot wheels received water from above, using both weight and flow for maximum efficiency. These beasts could reach 70% efficiency which honestly put some modern machines to shame. What did they power? Grain mills became the obvious choice, grinding wheat into flour for bread that fed entire cities. Then there were sawmills cutting timber for construction projects, hammers for metalworking, and even mechanisms for crushing olives into oil, all without burning a single piece of coal or connecting to any power grid. The engineering required serious mathematical skills too. Romans had to calculate water flow rates, gear ratios, and power transmission, essentially creating the first industrial complexes along riverbanks throughout their empire. Some wheels operated continuously for decades, requiring only occasional maintenance and repairs. But water wheels represented something bigger than just machinery. They showed how Romans thought about energy itself, finding ways to capture natural forces and put them to productive use. This mindset would eventually inspire medieval mills and even modern hydroelectric dams. Speaking of Roman innovation with lasting materials, though, their concrete formulations created structures that make today's construction look almost temporary by comparison. While Romans built impressive aqueducts and sewers, their secret weapon was actually what held everything together. Roman concrete wasn't just another building material, it was basically ancient superglue that laughed in the face of time. Here's where things get interesting. Most people think concrete is concrete, right? Well, Romans had discovered something that modern engineers are still trying to fully understand. They mixed lime with volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius, creating a chemical reaction that actually got stronger underwater. The weird part is that while our modern concrete starts cracking after 50 years, Roman concrete has been sitting in seawater for 2,000 years and is still rock solid. The Romans didn't have cement trucks or electric mixers. They combined their volcanic ash with lime, water, and chunks of stone using nothing but muscle power and wooden tools. But the real genius was in the ash itself. When seawater hit Roman concrete, it triggered a process that kept building tiny crystals inside the mixture, basically self-healing any cracks that tried to form. This stuff was so durable that Romans could build massive domes like the Pantheon, which still has the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. They constructed harbors that have survived countless storms and earthquakes. Some Roman bridges are still carrying traffic today, supporting cars and trucks the builders never could have imagined. Modern scientists have spent decades trying to recreate this formula, but volcanic ash from Vesuvius isn't exactly easy to ship worldwide. Makes sense, right? The Romans had stumbled onto construction gold, and they used it to build an empire that would literally stand the test of time. Speaking of building things that last, Romans weren't content with just mixing perfect concrete. They also mastered the art of digging through solid rock to reshape entire landscapes. When Romans decided they wanted to turn a swampy lake into farmland, they didn't just complain about it. They grabbed their pickaxes and started digging underground tunnels that would make modern engineers sweat just thinking about them. The Fucine Lake project stands as one of their most ambitious feats. Picture this massive lake in central Italy that kept flooding valuable agricultural land. The Romans looked at it and said, "Nope, we're draining this entire thing." Their solution? Dig a tunnel over 3.5 miles long straight through a mountain. But here's where it gets wild. They didn't have GPS or laser levels or any fancy surveying equipment. These guys used basic geometry, wooden measuring sticks, and pure mathematical brilliance to dig from both ends of the mountain simultaneously. The margin of error when the two teams met in the middle, just a few feet. That's insane precision for hand tools and torchlight. The engineering challenges were brutal. Workers had to deal with cave-ins, flooding, and suffocating air quality deep underground. They developed ventilation shafts, wooden support systems, and drainage techniques that kept the project moving forward for over a decade. Then there's the sheer human effort involved. Thousands of workers, many of them prisoners and slaves, chipped away at solid rock with hammers and chisels. No dynamite, no mechanical drills, just human determination and clever problem solving. What's remarkable is how these tunnel techniques spread throughout the empire. Romans used similar methods to drain mines, create underground aqueduct sections, and build passageways through hills. The skills they developed became the foundation for underground construction that lasted centuries. Speaking of lasting construction, Romans had another space-saving trick up their sleeves that transformed how people moved through tall buildings. Ever tried walking up a normal staircase in a cramped medieval tower? You'd probably end up with your head through the roof or your feet dangling in midair. Romans figured this out early and came up with something brilliant: spiral staircases that twisted upward like a stone tornado. These weren't just pretty architectural features. They solved a massive space problem that had been driving builders crazy for centuries. Traditional straight staircases ate up enormous amounts of floor space, which was pure gold in crowded Roman cities. But wrap those steps around a central column in a tight spiral, suddenly you're moving people up multiple floors without sacrificing precious room below. The engineering was surprisingly tricky. Each stone step had to be carved to exactly the right angle and depth. Too steep and people would tumble backward, too shallow and the staircase would sprawl outward like a lazy snake. Roman architects calculated the perfect rise and run for each step, creating comfortable climbs that could handle heavy foot traffic day after day. Trajan's column shows off this technology beautifully. Inside that towering monument, a spiral staircase winds up through the center, letting visitors climb to the top without any external supports or awkward landings. The steps are worn smooth by nearly 2,000 years of feet, but they're still perfectly functional. Then, there's the defensive advantage nobody talks about. Castle builders later discovered that spiral staircases gave defenders a huge edge during attacks. Enemies climbing up had their sword arms pressed against the central column, while defenders above could swing freely. Smart Romans probably knew this trick long before medieval knights figured it out. But Romans weren't the only civilization working with clever construction techniques. They also mastered ways to multiply human strength using simple mechanical principles that would revolutionize food production across the empire. From spiral staircases to kitchen innovation might seem like a big leap, but Romans were obsessed with making everything work better, including their food production. Ever tried squeezing grapes by hand? Your fingers cramp up after like 10 grapes, and you get maybe a few drops of juice. Now multiply that by thousands of grapes needed for wine production across an entire empire. The Romans had a brilliant solution that didn't require any fancy machinery or electricity. The screw press changed everything. This wasn't some complicated contraption, just a massive wooden screw that workers could turn to create incredible pressure. Think of it as the ancient world's hydraulic press, but powered entirely by human muscle and clever engineering. Here's where it gets interesting. The screw mechanism multiplied force dramatically. One person turning the handle could generate the crushing power of dozens of people stomping grapes. Romans used this same principle for olive oil production, which was absolutely crucial since olive oil wasn't just food. It was soap, lamp fuel, and medicine all rolled into one. The beauty lay in its simplicity: wooden frame, metal screw, heavy pressing plate on top. Workers would load grapes or olives into a basket, position it under the press, and start turning. The twisting motion slowly lowered a heavy wooden plate, squeezing out every drop of precious liquid. Some traditional wineries still use screw presses today, nearly 2,000 years later. That's staying power. The Romans basically perfected a technology so efficient that modern producers haven't found much reason to change it. But crushing grapes was just one part of Roman daily life. They also needed to know when to harvest those grapes in the first place, which meant keeping track of time itself. Ever been stuck wondering what time it was while traveling through ancient Rome? Well, the Romans had that covered with something pretty ingenious. They created portable sundials that could slip right into your pocket. These weren't just random pieces of metal with lines scratched on them. Roman engineers actually did the math to make these things work properly. They calculated sun angles for different seasons and even adjusted the markings for various cities across the empire. That's some serious geometry without a calculator in sight. The basic idea was simple enough: stick a small rod or piece of metal upright, and the shadow it cast would point to the time. But here's where it gets clever. Romans made different versions for different latitudes. A sundial that worked perfectly in Rome might be completely wrong in Britain, so they had to customize each one. Some of these pocket timepieces were tiny works of art. Craftsmen carved intricate designs around the time markings, turning a practical tool into something beautiful. The wealthy Romans especially loved showing off their fancy portable sundials at social gatherings. The really smart part? No moving parts to break, no batteries to die, and they lasted for decades. You just needed the sun to cooperate, which was usually fine in the Mediterranean climate. Sure, cloudy days were a problem, but that beat having no way to tell time at all when you were miles from the nearest public sundial. These little devices spread throughout the Roman world, helping merchants, soldiers, and travelers stay on schedule. And the weird part is, some of these ancient pocket sundials were more accurate than early mechanical clocks that came centuries later. Speaking of staying comfortable while traveling, Romans had another brilliant solution for making life more pleasant. While Romans were mastering underground heating with hippocausts, they discovered something brilliant. Why not heat entire public bathhouses? These weren't your average neighborhood pools. We're talking about massive social complexes that could pack in thousands of Romans at once, all without a single electric heater or modern pump system. The genius lay in combining their hippocaust technology with recycled aqueduct water. Hot air traveled through underground channels, warming floors and walls of enormous bathing halls. Romans created different temperature zones, scalding hot pools, lukewarm areas, and cold plunge baths. Want a steam room? They had those too, naturally heated by the same underground furnace system. But here's where it gets interesting. These bathhouses weren't just about getting clean. They became the social media of ancient Rome. People came to gossip, make business deals, exercise, and show off. Rich senators soaked next to regular citizens, creating a surprisingly democratic space in an otherwise hierarchical society. The engineering behind this comfort was remarkably simple, yet effective. Slaves fed wood into massive furnaces, heating air that circulated through brick channels beneath marble floors. Water flowed in from aqueducts, got warmed by the system, then drained away through sophisticated sewers. No electricity, no complex machinery, just clever use of heat, gravity, and water flow. Some of these ancient bathhouses were absolutely enormous. The baths of Caracalla could hold over 1,600 bathers simultaneously, covering 27 acres. The whole complex included libraries, gardens, and exercise areas, making it more like a modern spa resort than a simple bath. While Romans were revolutionizing public bathing, they were also perfecting another everyday technology that required incredible precision and artistry. Their approach to pottery would create tableware so durable it still amazes archaeologists today. When Romans wanted fancy dinnerware, they didn't just grab any old clay pot. They created something called Samian ware. Pottery so shiny and perfect it made regular dishes look like mud. This wasn't your grandmother's ceramic collection either. We're talking about tableware that could survive being buried underground for 2,000 years and still look gorgeous when archaeologists dig it up. The secret? Pure Roman obsession with getting things right. They mixed powdered minerals into their clay, then fired everything at temperatures hot enough to make modern potters sweat. No electric kilns, no digital temperature controls, just skilled craftsmen who knew exactly when the flames were perfect. The result was a glossy red finish, so smooth it practically glowed. But here's where it gets interesting. This pottery wasn't just pretty, it was tough as nails. Roman families used these dishes every single day, and they held up better than most modern plates. Drop one on your kitchen floor today, and you'd probably cry. Drop Roman Samian ware, and it might just laugh at you. The Romans were so proud of this stuff, they traded it across their entire empire. From Britain to Egypt, everyone wanted that signature red shine on their dining table. Archaeologists can actually track Roman trade routes just by following broken pottery pieces. Makes sense, right? Quality goods travel far. Then there's the manufacturing process itself. Workshops employed dozens of skilled potters who stamped decorative patterns into the clay before firing. Each piece was basically handcrafted art you could eat off of. Speaking of Roman innovations that moved things smoothly, their engineers also figured out how to reduce friction in ways that would make modern mechanics jealous. Ever wonder how the Romans managed to build those massive ships that could carry hundreds of people without modern ball bearings? Well, they basically invented their own version. These ancient engineers figured out that rolling beats sliding every single time. The Romans created roller bearings using wood and bronze, simple materials that solved a huge problem. When you're trying to move something heavy, friction is your worst enemy. But here's where Roman cleverness shines. Instead of dragging heavy objects across surfaces, they made them roll on cylindrical pieces. Lake Nemi held two enormous ships that were basically floating palaces for Emperor Caligula. These weren't your average fishing boats. We're talking about vessels over 200 feet long. The Romans used roller bearings in the steering mechanisms and winches of these giants, Makes sense, right? When you're trying to turn a rudder that weighs as much as a small house, you need all the mechanical advantage you can get. But the genius didn't stop at ships. Roman engineers placed these roller systems in cranes, heavy doors, and lifting equipment throughout the empire. They understood something that took humanity thousands of years to perfect. Reducing friction makes everything easier. The bronze rollers were placed between moving parts, just like the ball bearings in your car wheels today. No electricity required, just smart engineering and good materials. Some of these bearings were found perfectly preserved in shipwrecks, still smooth after nearly 2,000 years underwater. What's really wild is how this simple concept became the foundation for almost every machine we use today. Your bike, your car, even your office chair, they all use the same basic principle those Roman shipbuilders figured out centuries ago. Sometimes the best solutions are surprisingly simple. Getting frustrated with your energy bills? Trust me, I know the feeling. Last winter, I stared at my heating bill so long, I thought the numbers would magically shrink. But here's something wild. Our ancestors from the Middle Ages might have actually had some genius solutions we completely forgot about. While we're sitting here with our fancy thermostats and complaining about drafty windows, medieval folks were absolute pros at keeping warm without spending a single penny on electricity. And no, they weren't just sitting around freezing their boots off. They had some pretty clever tricks up their wool sleeves. You know what's really funny? These heating methods disappeared faster than your dad's hair in his 40s. Most of them got lost in the shuffle when the Industrial Revolution came rolling in with its shiny new technologies. Everyone was so excited about modern heating that they tossed these old-school methods aside like yesterday's leftovers. But get this, archaeologists recently discovered that some medieval homes maintained temperatures of up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit during winter, using nothing but these forgotten techniques. Pretty impressive for people who thought the Earth was flat, right? Speaking of impressive heating methods, let's talk about one of their coolest, or should I say warmest, inventions, the medieval hearth. It wasn't just some basic fireplace, it was the beating heart of every home, literally. Unlike our modern fireplaces tucked away in corners like shy teenagers at a school dance, medieval hearths stood proudly in the center of the main room. And boy, did they know what they were doing with this setup. Here's what made these hearths absolute genius. They worked with the entire house to create a natural heating system. The stones around and under the hearth would soak up heat during the day like a giant hot water bottle. Then, just like that friend who never knows when to leave a party, these stones would keep radiating warmth long after the fire died down. Some medieval buildings even had stones that stayed warm for up to 12 hours after the fire went out. The smoke was actually part of their master plan too. Instead of rushing up a chimney, which many houses didn't even have, it would slowly find its way out through gaps in the roof. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this smoke acted like a natural pest control system, keeping bugs out of the timbers and helping preserve food hanging from the rafters. Talk about killing two birds with one stone. Though I guess nowadays we'd say feeding two birds with one scone to be more politically correct. Recent studies of surviving medieval houses showed these central hearths could heat spaces up to 600 square feet effectively. That's about the size of a modern apartment. And get this, the stone floors around these hearths have been found with scorch marks from being constantly heated to temperatures over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Makes my attempts at heating up leftover pizza look pretty amateur in comparison. But what about those times when even the mighty hearth wasn't enough? Well, that's where the medieval folks got really creative with their community solutions. Speaking of which, wait until you hear about their ingenious communal fires. Because while we might complain about our neighbors today, medieval folks actually needed their neighbors, especially during winter. The whole "it takes a village" thing wasn't just a saying back then, it was their heating strategy. Every village had these amazing communal fire spots where people would gather to stay warm. And honestly, they sound way better than my neighborhood's HOA meetings. These communal fires were usually set up in the village square or a dedicated building called a warming house. And before you start thinking it was just a boring fire pit, these places were the medieval equivalent of our coffee shops, community centers, and social media all rolled into one. People would bring their work, share news, aka medieval Facebook, and even cook together. Historians found records showing some villages maintained these fires 24/7 during winter months, with families taking turns to keep them going. Here's something wild. Archaeologists discovered that these communal warming houses were strategically placed so that smoke would blow away from the village's main areas. These medieval engineers weren't messing around. They even calculated that a typical village warming house could serve up to 50 people at once, which is more efficient than running 50 separate home fires. Talk about medieval energy conservation. The best part? These spots created a real sense of community. People would share stories, arrange marriages, and even hold court sessions there. One historian found a record from 1267 where a village solved a property dispute over a chicken while warming their toes by the communal fire. Now that's what I call killing two birds with one. Well, maybe I shouldn't finish that saying given the chicken situation, but sometimes you couldn't make it to the communal fire, or maybe you just didn't feel like listening to Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down talk about her prize-winning turnips again. That's when personal heating solutions came in handy, like these clever little hand warmers and pocket stones, because personal heating in medieval times was like carrying around your own tiny furnace, except way cooler. These folks invented portable heating before portable anything was even a thing. Instead of those chemical hand warmers we use today for camping, medieval people carried heated stones and metal containers filled with hot coals. They were basically walking around with their own little pieces of their hearth. The most popular hand warmers were called chaufferettes, fancy French name for what was essentially a metal ball with holes in it. You'd fill these bad boys with hot coals and carry them in your pockets or muffs. Rich people had super fancy ones made of silver or gold, while regular folks used iron or copper. One medieval merchant's inventory from 1378 listed over 30 different types of hand warmers. Talk about product variety. The pocket stones were even more interesting. They'd heat these smooth river stones by the fire until they were toasty warm, then wrap them in bits of cloth. Archaeological digs have found thousands of these stones with telltale wear patterns from being constantly handled and reheated. Some even had little grooves worn into them from being carried in the same pocket day after day. Makes my phone's wear patterns look pretty boring in comparison. But here's where it gets really clever. They didn't just use these for their hands. People would put heated stones in their boots, tuck them into their clothes, or even use them to warm up their beds before sleeping. There's this hilarious court record from 1422 where a man got in trouble for accidentally taking someone else's heated stone at a church service. Apparently, stone warming theft was a real crime back then. The punishment? He had to provide heated stones for the entire congregation for the rest of winter. Some doctors even prescribed specific types of stones for different ailments. Got a stomachache? Here's a flat stone. Sore back? Try this curved one. It was like the medieval version of a heating pad prescription. The funny part is, modern science shows they weren't totally wrong. Heat therapy actually does help with certain types of pain. And when personal heating wasn't quite enough, medieval folks turned to an even more interesting source of warmth: their furry friends. But I'm not talking about cats and dogs here. The medieval solution for home heating involves some much bigger animals. In fact, you might be wondering why medieval barns were often connected to houses. Well, it wasn't because farmers were too lazy to walk outside. They were actually using their livestock as living, breathing furnaces. A single cow gives off as much heat as a small space heater, about 1,000 BTUs per hour. Now multiply that by 5 or 6 cows, throw in a couple of sheep, and you've got yourself a serious heating system. Medieval farmers would build their homes with a clever setup. The living areas would share a wall with the animal barn, usually on the north side, to block those chilly winds. The animal's body heat would seep through the walls, creating a natural warming effect. It's like having a bunch of space heaters that also produce milk and wool. Studies of surviving medieval farmhouses show that rooms sharing walls with animal pens stayed about 10 degrees warmer than other rooms. The best part? These animals were basically self-maintaining heaters. Feed them some hay and they'd keep pumping out warmth all night long. Sure, the smell wasn't great. Medieval air fresheners weren't really a thing, but I guess when you're freezing, a little farm fragrance is better than turning into a human icicle. One medieval text from 1382 actually gives specific instructions about which animals make the best heaters. Cows were top tier, followed by horses, while chickens, well, let's just say they were the medieval equivalent of those tiny USB heaters that barely work. There's even a record of a landlord in 1415 who charged less rent for houses that didn't share a wall with the barn. Medieval real estate's first heating included discount. But what about folks who couldn't handle the barnyard aromatherapy? Well, they got pretty creative with their next heating solution. Using some seriously smart science, even though they didn't know it was science, they figured out how to make fire work twice as hard using reflectors. Because long before anyone knew about the physics of heat reflection, these clever folks discovered that shiny metal plates and polished stone surfaces could bounce heat back into a room like a basketball player, making a perfect pass. The most common reflectors were made from polished brass or copper sheets, strategically placed around fireplaces and cooking areas. These weren't your average bathroom mirrors. We're talking about massive metal plates, some as big as dining tables. Archaeological finds show that by the 14th century, some wealthy homes had entire walls covered in polished metal panels. Talk about medieval bling with a purpose. The science behind it is pretty impressive. Tests on recreated medieval reflectors showed they could increase a room's temperature by up to 30%. That's like getting a third more heat from the same amount of firewood. And these folks figured this out centuries before anyone understood how heat radiation worked. My high school physics teacher would have been impressed. Here's a fun fact. One medieval castle in France had silver-plated walls in its great hall. The lord who installed them wasn't just showing off his wealth, he was actually creating a massive heat reflector system. Though, I bet explaining that to the tax collector was interesting. No, really, the silver walls are for heating, not just to make my neighbors jealous. The best part? They discovered that curved reflectors worked even better than flat ones. Some clever medieval engineers even designed corner fireplaces with curved metal backs that could spread heat across an entire room. It's like they invented medieval surround sound, but for heat. These curved reflectors were so effective that some medieval documents show people actually complained about rooms being too hot. Now that's a winter problem we'd love to have. Records from a monastery in 1388 mention a particularly clever setup where they used a series of angled reflectors to direct heat into the monastery's infirmary, creating what we'd now call targeted heating zones. The monks called it God's mirrors, though I'm pretty sure God was more impressed with their prayers than their heating system. But what about those cold winter nights when even the fanciest reflectors couldn't quite cut it? That's when medieval folks broke out their secret weapon for a cozy night's sleep. The bed warmer, aka the medieval electric blanket, was pure genius in its simplicity. A long-handled copper or brass pan filled with hot coals would be slid between the sheets like a giant warm sandwich filling. These warming pans weren't just practical, they were often beautifully decorated with patterns and designs, making them the medieval equivalent of those fancy gadgets we keep in our kitchens today. Each pan could hold enough hot coals to keep a bed toasty for about 2 to 3 hours, which was usually enough time to fall into a cozy sleep. Rich people would have servants warm their beds for them, while common folks would do the coal shuffling themselves. Fun fact, archaeologists found one pan from 1435 with "Sweet dreams, don't let the ice bite" engraved on its handle. Seems like medieval folks had a sense of humor about their chilly nights. But here's where it gets interesting. They had a whole system worked out. The coals would be carefully selected from the evening fire, with the best ones saved for bed warming. Why? Because nobody wanted to wake up to smoky sheets or, worse, a fire. Records show that some towns actually had special bed warmer inspectors whose job was to make sure people weren't using dangerous coals. Talk about a weird job title to put on your medieval LinkedIn. A single warming pan could raise bed temperatures by about 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to turn a freezing bed into a cozy nest. Some clever folks even developed a rotation system using multiple pans throughout the night. One historical document mentions a particularly cold winter in 1442 when a nobleman used 6 different warming pans to keep his massive bed heated. That's what I call high-maintenance sleeping. But for those who couldn't afford fancy warming pans or didn't trust themselves not to set their beds on fire, there was another solution that helped keep the warmth in while they slept. Enter the canopy bed, and trust me, it wasn't just about looking fancy. Because canopy beds weren't just medieval interior designers showing off, they were actually brilliant heat traps. The heavy curtains around these beds worked like a personal sleeping bag, keeping your body heat from escaping into the cold room. Records show these beds could maintain temperatures up to 15 degrees warmer than the rest of the room, making them the original sleep pods. Medieval carpenters became experts at designing these beds for maximum warmth. The best ones had double-layered curtains and a covered top that created a mini room within the room. Some even had special slots built into the posts to hold those bed warmers we talked about earlier. Talk about medieval smart home technology. The funny thing is, people started competing over who had the fanciest bed curtains. One record from 1389 mentions a merchant who spent more on his bed curtains than his house. Now that's what I call mixed up priorities. But at least he was warm. Scientists tested a recreated medieval canopy bed and found that with all curtains closed, it only took about 10 minutes for body heat to create a cozy microclimate inside. But what about staying warm during the day? Well, medieval builders had another trick up their sleeves. They turned their attention to something we still use today, the power of the sun. And they were way better at using it than most modern architects, because these medieval builders were basically solar power pioneers, just without the fancy panels. They figured out that if you built a house with big windows facing south, you could trap the sun's heat like a champ. These weren't your regular windows either. They were strategically placed to catch the low winter sun while staying shady during summer. It's like they invented seasonal temperature control before air conditioning was even a dream. The real genius came from how they used stone walls. They'd build these thick walls that would soak up heat during the day and slowly release it at night, like a stone hot water bottle. Tests on surviving medieval buildings showed these walls could store enough heat to keep rooms warm for up to 8 hours after sunset. Some castles even had special sunrooms with walls up to 6 feet thick. Now, that's what I call extreme insulation. You know those modern passive solar homes everyone's talking about? Turns out medieval builders beat them to it by about 800 years. Archaeological studies found that some medieval houses were angled exactly 17.5 degrees east of true south, the perfect position for maximum sun exposure during winter. And here I am, still trying to figure out which way is north on my phone's compass. A particularly clever lord in 1356 had his great hall built with different sized windows on each floor. The bottom windows were smaller to prevent heat loss, while the top ones were huge sun catchers. His servants probably thought he was crazy, but energy bills weren't exactly a thing back then, were they? But sometimes even the smartest sun-catching tricks weren't enough to keep out the cold. That's when medieval builders would look up, way up, to their next heating solution, those seemingly simple thatched roofs. Weren't just medieval folks trying to look rustic, they were actually incredible natural insulators. Pack straw creates thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat, working just like modern home insulation. But unlike that pink stuff in our attics today, these roofs were completely natural and lasted for decades. A well-made thatched roof could be up to 2 feet thick, and tests show they were better at keeping heat in than most modern roofing materials. The really wild part? These roofs actually breathed. They'd let just enough moisture escape to prevent mold while keeping all the warm air inside. A properly thatched roof could reduce heat loss by up to 50% compared to other medieval roofing options. One medieval record from 1397 mentions a particularly snowy winter where thatched houses stayed so warm the inhabitants had to open their windows. In January. Meanwhile, their tile-roof neighbors were probably huddled around their fires, wondering what kind of magic was happening next door. But the best invention for staying warm during those long winter nights? Well, that came from some seriously creative thinking about where to put hot rocks. These medieval heating engineers had one last trick up their sleeves, and it involved turning the floor into a giant heating pad. Because here's the thing about really big stones. They hold on to heat like teenagers hold on to their phones. Medieval people discovered that if you heated up large stones in a fire and then tucked them under the floorboards, they'd radiate warmth for hours. It was like having heated floors before heated floors were cool. A typical setup would use stones weighing between 20 to 30 pounds each. They'd heat these bad boys up during the day, then slide them into special slots under the wooden floors or benches. Tests on similar stones showed they could stay warm for up to 6 hours. And get this, some medieval houses had dedicated stone warming pits built right into their kitchens, like a prehistoric microwave just for rocks. The really fancy places even had stone warming schedules. Documents from one 15th century manor house show they rotated 24 stones throughout the day, with servants switching them out every 4 hours. Talk about a hot job. Scientists estimate this system could maintain room temperatures around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, even when it was freezing outside. One monk wrote in 1403 about how they used this trick in the monastery's infirmary. He called it God's own heating, though I'm pretty sure God would have just invented central heating if he was directly involved in medieval architecture. And there you have it, 10 genius medieval heating methods that put our modern solutions to shame. Makes you wonder what other brilliant ideas we've forgotten over the centuries, doesn't it? Maybe it's time to bring some of these back. Minus the barnyard smells, of course. Think medieval castles were just boring old stone fortresses? Think again. These ancient strongholds hide 10 mind-blowing secrets that will change everything you thought you knew. The lords and ladies who lived in castles wanted comfort just as much as protection. While the outer walls were all business with arrow slits and murder holes, the inner chambers were a world of color and luxury. Walls that look bare today were once covered in vibrant painted scenes with reds, blues, and golds. Comfort was key for these medieval elites. Their floors featured imported fancy tiles from across Europe, creating beautiful patterns. The finest castles had glass windows when glass cost more than gold by weight. Most regular folks had to choose between freezing with open windows or suffocating with wooden shutters. Meanwhile, castle dwellers were basically living in medieval greenhouses. Those massive fireplaces you see in castle ruins could burn entire trees and were kept going day and night during winter. Enormous tapestries hung on walls weren't just decorative. They were medieval insulation, keeping drafts at bay in rooms big enough to fit 3 modern houses. The Great Hall hosted everything from royal feasts to legal proceedings. Tables could stretch nearly 100 feet with strict seating arrangements where moving one seat closer to the Lord was considered a major promotion. Nothing says, "I'm royalty," quite like trying to enjoy your expensive imported wine while dodging dive-bombing pigeons that flew in through the smoke holes. Even the most luxurious castles never forgot their military purpose. Beautiful arched windows were set high enough that arrows couldn't easily fly in. Decorative carvings often hid defensive features. Even dining arrangements were strategic. Trusted advisors sat with their backs to walls, while suspicious guests were placed where they could be watched. Castle builders were really smart about mixing deadly useful features with showing off luxury everywhere. And these clever designs were in every corner of these amazing buildings, including some surprising building tricks that helped the people inside win fights. Ever wonder why castle staircases always make you dizzy? It wasn't just bad medieval architecture, it was medieval battle strategy at its finest. Look at any old castle spiral staircase and you'll notice they almost always twist clockwise going up. This wasn't random, it was a fighting hack. Since most attackers were right-handed, this design forced them to fight with their sword arms squished against the center column. Their sword swings ended up about as effective as trying to do karate in a phone booth. Meanwhile, defenders coming down the stairs had their right arms on the outside of the spiral with plenty of room to swing. Home field advantage has never been so literal. Some castles took this sneakiness even further. They built steps of slightly different heights throughout the same staircase. The people who lived there knew exactly which steps were wonky, but invaders didn't. One wrong step, and you'd tumble down the stairs faster than a medieval knight after 8 cups of mead. The original TripAdvisor was actually a castle architect. In Conwy Castle in Wales, you can still see worn spots on the spiral stairs where people have stepped in the exact same safe places for over 700 years. That's the world's oldest continuous watch your step warning. The really clever bit? Some castles had a few special staircases that turned the opposite way, counterclockwise. These were built specifically for left-handed defenders. About 1 in 10 medieval knights were lefties, just like today. Left-handed fighters were sometimes especially valued in castle defense, medieval warfare's first southpaw advantage long before baseball existed. These twisted staircases weren't just architectural features, they were built-in weapons that could mean the difference between life and death. And while these sneaky stairs kept unwanted visitors from getting in, the castle walls themselves held another secret. Thick walls did more than just protect castles, they often hid secret chambers that few people knew about. Castle walls could be up to 12 feet thick, with plenty of space to hide entire rooms between the inner and outer stone faces. Finding the entrances was nearly impossible unless you knew the secret. Some opened when you pulled a certain candle holder or touched a specific stone. Others hid behind moving wooden panels that looked like normal wall decorations. In one famous castle in Europe, a hidden passage connected to caves that brought in food during attacks, which explained why the defenders never ran out of supplies. These hidden spaces served different jobs around the castle. Many were escape routes with tunnels leading outside to safety. When unwanted guests showed up without warning, castle owners suddenly remembered urgent business requiring the secret exit tunnel. Some chambers were listening spots where castle lords could hear what visitors said when they thought nobody was around. Tiny holes and decorative wall carvings let sound travel to hidden rooms where someone could listen to every word. Hidden treasure rooms were very common. When danger came, gold coins and jewels would disappear into wall spaces that looked like solid stone from outside. These hiding spots worked so well that some treasures stayed lost for hundreds of years. A person fixing an old castle wall in France found 400 gold coins worth over $900,000 that had been hidden since the 1600s. The darkest secret rooms were prison cells called oubliettes, from a word meaning to forget, because once someone went in, they were meant to be forgotten forever. These were often small spaces under trap doors where prisoners could be dropped and abandoned. Medieval castle builders knew how to keep secrets. They created the first private chat rooms centuries before the internet existed. Modern tools like radar still find new hidden rooms in old castles today, proving that many secrets remain undiscovered after hundreds of years. While these hidden spaces kept private things private, some castle features did the exact opposite. These medieval bathrooms were usually small rooms jutting out from castle walls, with everything dropping straight down through chutes to whatever was below, often the moat or just the ground. No toilet paper existed back then. Wealthy folk used wool or hemp, while others used leaves, moss, or their left hand. Medieval bathroom etiquette was simple. Left hand for wiping, right hand for eating, and both hands for praying. Nothing splashed back up. At Dover Castle, some garderobes emptied into a central shaft, dropping 60 feet into the ground. Castle designers tried to make things less smelly by placing toilets on the windy sides of castles. Some even had tiny windows for airflow. You know your plumbing is bad when your bathroom design depends on good weather. The truly bizarre part? Garderobe actually means clothes guard, because people stored their fancy clothes in these stinky bathroom spaces. They believed the awful smell would keep moths away from their expensive fabrics. Medieval fashion tip: if your outfit smells worse than the outhouse, you're doing formal wear correctly. During battles, these toilet chutes became a surprising weak point. Enemies sometimes climbed up the waste chutes to sneak into castles during sieges. Imagine wanting to conquer a castle so badly you'd climb through centuries of toilet waste. Talk about dedicated warriors. Long sieges created major bathroom problems. With hundreds of people trapped inside for months, garderobes would overflow. During the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1204, defenders had to throw out the weakest people because they couldn't handle the waste situation. Waste dropped into a chute that opened outside the wall, often onto unsuspecting people. In medieval times, heads up wasn't just a friendly warning. It was survival advice when walking near castle walls. While castle toilet technology was pretty basic, at least their defensive entrances were much more advanced. Some drawbridges weren't just lifted, they were rigged to collapse on purpose. While most castle bridges simply went up and down, the clever medieval engineers designed special trap drawbridges with sections that could suddenly drop away. When enemy soldiers rushed across what looked like a normal bridge, defenders would pull hidden levers or cut ropes and, surprise, the middle would fall out. Nothing ruins a knight's day quite like the bridge disappearing beneath his feet mid-charge. At Caerphilly Castle, evidence shows their trap bridge could collapse in less than 2 seconds, barely enough time to say, "Oh no," before splashing into the moat. Other castles had tilt bridges that worked like giant seesaws, suddenly pivoting to slide attackers off into the water or onto spikes below. Medieval engineers basically invented the slip and slide, except theirs ended with spears instead of a pool. The real genius came when these trap bridges were combined with portcullises, those heavy spiked gates that dropped down from above. Attackers would charge across the bridge, then the portcullis would slam down behind them, trapping them between gates. At the same time, the bridge might collapse, cutting off their retreat. Once trapped in this murder box, defenders had plenty of options for dealing with the unwelcome guests. Arrow slits and holes in the ceiling let them shoot arrows or pour down boiling water, heated sand, or burning oil. It was like a deadly game show where getting eliminated was extremely literal. Harlech Castle took this to the extreme, with 6 different obstacles protecting its entrance: Multiple drawbridges, portcullises, and doors created a deadly obstacle course for attackers. While these clever bridges protected the front door with moving parts and sudden drops, the moats surrounding many castles weren't just filled with water. Creating a water moat meant finding a water source, building systems to keep it flowing, and dealing with freezing, flooding, and algae. That's a lot of work just to make a big puddle around your home. The cheaper option? Digging a ditch and filling it with all sorts of nasty surprises. Many dry moats contained wooden stakes pointing upward, thorn bushes, and caltrops, four-pointed metal spikes that always landed with one point facing up. Medieval castle designers took "keep off the lawn" signs to a whole new level. The truly gross moats combined these obstacles with castle waste. Without proper plumbing, many castles dumped their garbage and sewage into the moat. The only thing worse than falling into a pit of spikes was falling into a pit of spikes covered in last week's rotten cabbage soup and toilet contents. In war times, defenders added animal bones to dry moats. These weren't for decoration. Broken bones could create surprisingly sharp edges. One Middle Eastern fortress reportedly filled its moat with snakes, which might just be the earliest recorded case of extreme home security. The smell from these garbage-filled moats created another defense layer. Approaching armies would smell the castle long before seeing it. In medieval times, falling into the moat wasn't just dangerous. It meant you'd need at least 3 baths before anyone would sit next to you again. Birds and rats loved these garbage moats, creating yet another problem for attackers. Imagine trying to look fierce while fighting off rats climbing up your armor. Archaeological digs at castle sites have found thousands of items in old moat beds: weapons, pottery, jewelry, and sometimes human remains. One English castle moat contained over 2,000 everyday objects, proving that medieval people threw away just as much junk as we do. Dry moats were also easier to maintain than water-filled ones. They didn't flood fields during rains or freeze solid during winter. For practical castle owners, a good garbage-filled dry moat was the medieval version of affordable home security. While these stinky moats kept enemies at a distance, the stone castle walls themselves held even more secrets. Stone corridors often created natural echo chambers that made castles into medieval surveillance systems. In many castles, whispers from one tower could travel clearly to another corner thanks to the way sound bounced off curved stone walls. Round rooms were especially tricky. Words whispered on one side could be heard perfectly on the opposite wall, but not in the middle. Castle architects were basically creating medieval wiretaps before phones even existed. These acoustic features weren't just happy accidents. Some castle builders deliberately created whispering galleries where sound traveled in surprising ways. At Bodiam Castle, the Great Hall was designed so the Lord could eavesdrop on visitors at the entrance gate. He could hear what people said about him before they knew he was listening. Medieval social media monitoring at its finest. Servants quickly figured out these sound tricks and used them for gossip gathering. The first information leaks weren't on computers. They were servants standing in the right corner of a stone hallway. Many castles had small air shafts or channels running between rooms. These were officially for ventilation, but they also carried conversations from one room to another like stone speakerphones. At Carisbrooke Castle, tiny passages connected the main meeting room to a private chamber perfect for secret listening. Smart castle dwellers developed counter-espionage techniques. They played music, ran fountains, or hung thick tapestries to break up sound waves. Others held important meetings outdoors where stone couldn't betray their words. The craftiest nobles used these acoustic tricks to spread false information. They'd stage private conversations near spots where they knew sound would travel to certain ears. Medieval fake news didn't need printing presses, just strategically placed whispers in echo-friendly corners. The phrase, "walls have ears," wasn't just a saying in medieval times. In stone castles, it was literally true. But those walls weren't just hiding sounds. Location was everything when building a castle. Good spots were usually high ground with great views that had been valued for hundreds or even thousands of years. This meant many castle builders weren't the first people to use these prime locations, and sometimes they built right on top of very old burial grounds. Building on older sacred sites wasn't just coincidence. It sent a powerful message about the new ruler taking over everything, including the important places of the past. It also saved a lot of work. Why level a new hilltop when there's already a flat area that someone else prepared? Ireland's Leap Castle sits on land that was used for ceremonies and burials long before the castle existed. During renovations in the 1900s, workers discovered an underground pit filled with countless human skeletons. This wasn't a normal burial. Many of the bones showed signs of being stabbed with spikes. The castle itself had been built directly over this mass grave. When the real estate agent said the place had lots of character, they weren't kidding. At Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, archaeologists found evidence of people living and burying their dead on the castle rock at least 3,000 years before the current castle was built. The builders of the medieval castle knew they were on old sacred ground, but built there anyway. Castle dungeons often had creepy connections to death. To save effort, castle builders would sometimes convert existing crypts or tombs into prison cells. The dungeon at Chillingham Castle was originally built as a mass grave for plague victims, then later turned into a place to hold prisoners. Talk about a room with bad energy. First you die of plague there, then they lock people up in your burial spot. Many castles had their own burial crypts right below the main floors. Glamis Castle in Scotland has an underground crypt where generations of the same family were laid to rest, with the living relatives walking and dancing on the floors directly above. At mealtimes, the dining hall would be full of noise and laughter, while just a few feet below, dozens of ancestors lay in silent tombs. Some castle chapels were built with thin walls separating the prayer area from burial chambers. The idea was that the dead could hear the prayers being said for them. A few castles even had small openings between the chapel and the crypts so that the smell of incense could reach the dead. Medieval air fresheners had a lot of work to do in those situations. Castle ghost stories often connect to these burial grounds. When Dover Castle expanded in the 1200s, workers disturbed ancient Saxon burials. According to castle records, workers refused to continue until proper reburials were arranged because they claimed to see figures walking the site at night. The medieval mind didn't separate the living world from the dead as much as we do today. Having ancestors buried nearby was seen as protection, not something creepy. Castle dwellers viewed these burials as a way to claim the power and history of a place. While human remains might have stayed quietly in the walls and under the floors, other living creatures had free run of medieval castles, some welcome and some definitely not. These medieval fortresses might have housed kings and queens, but rats ruled the spaces between walls and under floors. A single castle could house thousands of rats in its nooks and crannies. While the lord of the castle might claim to own everything inside the walls, the rats held the real majority vote. Castle kitchens were rat paradise, with food prepared in massive quantities and scraps often tossed aside. Rats enjoyed an endless buffet. Medieval rats didn't need to make restaurant reservations. They just showed up to the kitchen and seated themselves. The castle design made controlling rats nearly impossible. Stone walls had countless gaps where rats could slip through, and floors had spaces between boards where they could travel unseen. Rats basically had their own secret highway system within the walls, while humans had to use the stairs like suckers. Castle dwellers tried everything to control these pests. Cats were the most common solution, with many castles employing dozens of felines as rat hunters. Records from the Tower of London show they once had an official yeoman warder of the cats. The original pest control specialists got paid in room, board, and leftover fish heads, the medieval equivalent of an unpaid internship with free snacks. Some castles used ferrets or even kept owls inside to hunt rats that came out at night. Medieval pest control was basically assembling a tiny animal avengers team to fight rodent crime. Yet despite all these predators, the rats always won. Their ability to reproduce quickly, a single pair can have up to 2,000 descendants in 1 year, meant they couldn't be eliminated. Some castle owners paid servants for each rat tail turned in, creating a medieval bounty system. Medieval resume skills often included expert rat hunter, alongside sword polishing and banner waving. The funniest rat stories come from formal events. One French king reportedly threw his crown at a rat during his coronation dinner, missing the rat but hitting an important bishop instead. The rat escaped unharmed, while the bishop went home with a royal headache and a story nobody would believe. While rats were unwelcome visitors, castle owners sometimes voluntarily brought in even stranger animals to impress their guests. Nobles collected exotic animals to show off their wealth and power, and many of these creatures lived right inside the castle walls. Many royal castles housed lions. One fortress kept a chained bear in the courtyard. Lions, leopards, and monkeys weren't just for outdoor display. Many lived in special chambers inside castles. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with a lion roaring in the next room. That beats having noisy neighbors with a loud TV. One royal kept a pet cheetah that roamed freely through her chambers. The castle staff lived in constant fear of turning corners, never knowing when they might face the speedy predator. Several records mention visitors refusing to stay overnight when they learned about the castle's unusual residents. Birds were especially popular castle pets. Eagles and falcons lived in special chambers called mews. Peacocks strutted around castle grounds, and their colorful feathers decorated great halls. Peacocks were cooked and refeathered before serving, purely for drama. Medieval dining involved more arts and crafts than eating. The truly rich went beyond ordinary exotic animals. Records mention a European ruler who kept a giraffe in his castle. Another royal received an elephant as a gift and built a special structure to house it. Unfortunately, the elephant died after just 2 years. Medieval Europe wasn't ideal for African wildlife. Monkeys often served as pets for noble ladies. Larger primates like baboons might be kept chained in the Great Hall as conversation pieces. One castle had a baboon that learned to mimic the castle priest's blessing movements, causing quite a scandal. Some castles even kept crocodiles in special chambers with water pools. The castle tour guide job was a lot more exciting back then. And on your left is the royal throne room, and on your right, a giant man-eating reptile from the Nile. These exotic animals needed special care. Some castles had dedicated staff just for feeding and maintaining the menagerie. Food for meat-eating animals was particularly challenging in winter, making exotic pets extremely expensive to keep. From hidden rooms to clever defenses, from ghostly burials to exotic animals, medieval castles were far more than just stone fortresses. They were complex worlds filled with surprising secrets that made them the most fascinating buildings of their time.